This one's about my friend Ruby, who worked at a high-end pet grooming salon that catered to rich, often eccentric clients who treated their pets like royalty. Ruby had seen it all. Poodles with custom-dyed jobs, cats with manicures, even a pet ferret that got a lavender-scented bubble bath every week. But nothing prepared her for the time she had to groom a prize Sphynx cat named Cleo, who belonged to an obscenely wealthy client. Cleo's owner, a woman with a penchant for designer everything, called the salon one afternoon in a panic. Apparently, Cleo had an emergency, and only Ruby could handle it. Ruby thought she'd be dealing with a matted fur situation or maybe even some minor cuts from a particularly wild play session. But when she arrived at the salon, she was greeted by the sight of Cleo perched regally on a satin pillow, wearing a diamond-studded collar and looking every bit like a feline queen. The woman explained, nearly in tears, that Cleo had overindulged on pate and was, to put it delicately, suffering the consequences. The consequences, it turned out, were severe. Cleo had gone on a wild streak, wreaking havoc in her owner's pristine mansion and, in the process, getting herself in a state of filth and fury. Ruby, trying to maintain a straight face, assured the woman that she'd handle the delicate cleanup. What followed was the most intense 2 hours of Ruby's grooming career. Sphynx cats, being hairless, are a different beast altogether when it comes to grooming. Every wrinkle, every fold had to be carefully cleaned. Cleo was not a cooperative client either. She hissed, growled, and even managed to swipe at Ruby's arm, leaving a nasty scratch. At one point, Cleo's owner, who had insisted on staying to supervise, offered to calm Cleo by playing her favorite Mozart symphony on her phone. Ruby just nodded, trying not to laugh as the room filled with the strains of Mozart, while Cleo squirmed and protested with all the dignity of a queen in exile. Finally, after a deep clean, a rinse, and a lavender oil rub, the owner insisted it was Cleo's signature scent. Ruby wrapped Cleo in a heated towel and handed her back, exhausted but proud. Cleo's owner was beyond thrilled, going on about how Ruby had saved the day and calling her the groomer extraordinaire. She left a jaw-dropping tip and even suggested that Ruby should groom Cleo regularly for maintenance. After that, Cleo became a monthly client, and each visit came with some new odd request, from specific music to custom lotions. And every time, Ruby would just shake her head, thinking of Cleo's very first emergency spa day. Now, whenever she hears Mozart, she can't help but laugh, remembering that high-maintenance Sphynx cat and the lengths she went to keep her royalty approved. Our school mascot was this big, slightly terrifying falcon statue that sat proudly in the front lobby. It was about 6 feet tall, made of bronze, and guarded the entrance like some ancient relic. For years, every senior class had fantasized about stealing it, but no one had ever managed to pull it off. The falcon was heavy, bolted to the floor, and positioned right under a security camera. But one day, my friend Lucas, who'd spent way too much time studying the school's layout, came to us with a wild idea. What if we make a copy of the falcon and swap it with the real one? The plan was so crazy that we couldn't resist. Lucas had access to his dad's garage, which was full of tools, so we decided to build a decoy. It took us 2 full weekends of sneaking around, late nights covered in paint and metal dust, but we managed to make a passable replica out of cardboard, spray paint, and a few metal pipes for the legs. It wasn't perfect up close, but from a few feet away, it looked surprisingly legit. The night before the last day of school, we put the plan into action. Lucas somehow convinced his cousin, who happened to work security at a nearby mall, to lend him a uniform. Our security guard buddy was supposed to handle any teacher or custodian who got suspicious. Just after midnight, we all met at the school, slipped in through an open window we'd unlocked earlier in the day, and tiptoed through the dark hallways, trying not to laugh and blow our cover. Getting to the falcon was easy. The real challenge was unbolting it without making too much noise. After what felt like an eternity of holding our breath, we got it loose. Lucas and I grabbed the base while the others kept lookout, slowly lifting it off its spot and hauling it toward the window. In its place, we set up our decoy, arranging it carefully to make sure it looked just right under the dim lights of the lobby. We stashed the real falcon in Lucas's truck, then drove it across town to his basement, where it would live until we figured out what to do with it. It was so tempting to keep it forever, but we knew that would probably get us banned from graduation. So we went with Plan B, return it as a surprise right before the ceremony. The next morning, the whole school was buzzing. Teachers and students filed past the fake falcon without a clue. We watched from a distance, trying not to laugh every time someone admired it like it was the original. It was a solid 2 hours before the assistant principal even noticed something was off, and when he did, he just stood there squinting at it, clearly questioning his sanity. Finally, he called in the principal, who touched the decoy, frowned, and then shouted, "Where's the real one?" For the rest of the day, it was chaos. Teachers were interrogating seniors, security footage was being reviewed, and an announcement went out offering full immunity if the falcon was returned. But we held strong, giving nothing away, knowing that we'd planned the perfect finale. On graduation day, we got to the school early and snuck the real falcon back into the lobby, placing it right where it belonged. We left a note on it that said, "Class of 2023, we'll always be here in spirit." When the doors opened and the faculty saw it, the look on their faces was priceless. The principal just sighed, muttering, "Only this class," but he was smiling as he said it. The whole school knew what we'd done, and even the teachers had to admit it was brilliant. To this day, I hear rumors that they still check the falcon every morning, just in case the spirits of the class of 2023 decide to strike again. I almost didn't go to the event that night. It was a networking mixer, full of people I barely knew, and I'd only agreed because my coworker had begged me for moral support. I told myself I'd show up, have one drink, and sneak out early, my usual strategy for these things. So, I arrived, grabbed a glass of wine, and stationed myself at a corner table, nodding politely through small talk and trying not to count the minutes. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against a wall, looking as bored as I felt, his expression somewhere between disinterest and curiosity. There was something about him that made him stand out in the crowd. A relaxed confidence, a calm intensity that somehow drew me in. I caught his eye, and he held my gaze a little longer than expected, giving me a small smile that felt oddly familiar. Before I knew it, he was walking over, introducing himself as Alex. His voice was soft but steady, and his presence had this quiet energy that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. We fell into an easy conversation, the kind that skips past the surface and dives into the things that really matter. Within minutes, we were talking about books, places we wanted to travel, strange childhood memories, everything but work, and I was grateful for it. As the night went on, the event started to fade around us. I barely noticed the crowd thinning or the music changing. We were in our own world, wrapped up in laughter and quiet stories, letting the rest of the room blur away. I'd forgotten what it felt like to connect with someone so quickly, to share pieces of myself that I usually kept tucked away. Eventually, he asked if I wanted to go somewhere quieter. I said yes without hesitation, feeling a rush of excitement as he led me out onto the quiet, moonlit street. We wandered aimlessly, talking, laughing, the cool night air making everything feel more real, more vivid. He reached for my hand at one point, and it felt natural, like something we'd done 1,000 times before. I could feel my heart racing, but there was a calmness to it too, a sense that this moment was exactly where I was meant to be. We ended up at a small park nearby, sitting on an empty bench under a canopy of trees. The quietness of the space felt like a cocoon, wrapping around us as we shared stories, secrets, and confessions that felt like gifts. He told me about his love for painting, how he was always searching for beauty in unexpected places, and I found myself listening to every word, hanging onto the softness in his voice, the way he saw the world. There was a pause, a comfortable silence, and then he looked at me with a tenderness that made my heart ache. He leaned in slowly, and when his lips met mine, it was gentle and unhurried, as if we had all the time in the world. It was a kiss that felt like an invitation, a promise, something that went beyond words, and I found myself melting into it, letting everything else fall away. We stayed there for hours, talking, laughing, our voices blending into the quiet hum of the night. I felt like I'd known him forever, like he'd somehow stepped into my life out of nowhere and belonged there. He made me feel seen, understood, and I hadn't realized how much I'd been craving that feeling. When dawn began to creep over the horizon, we both knew it was time to go. He walked me home, our hands entwined, the world around us still soft with the early morning light. When we reached my door, there was a lingering silence, both of us reluctant to say goodbye. He gave me a small, almost wistful smile, and I felt a pang of sadness, knowing that perfect nights like this rarely lasted. "Thank you for tonight," he said, his voice quiet, his eyes holding something I couldn't quite name. I smiled, nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. And then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the gentle light of dawn, my heart full and a little heavy. The rest of that day felt surreal, like I was walking through a dream, replaying every moment in my mind, the laughter, the closeness, the way he'd looked at me like he was seeing something deeper. It was a memory that felt both fragile and powerful, something I wanted to hold on to even as I knew it was already slipping away. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about that night, about Alex, about the way he'd listened, the way he'd made me feel like I was the only person in the world. It was a reminder of what it felt like to connect, to let someone in, even if only for a night. I realized that, as much as I loved the magic of it, I wanted more than just a fleeting moment. I wanted something that didn't end with a quiet goodbye, something that could last beyond a single night. That night with Alex left me with a quiet hope, a sense of what's possible, and a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful moments are the ones you don't expect, the ones that catch you off guard and leave you changed. Until I find that again, I'll carry this memory close, a little spark of magic to remind me of the connection I know is out there, waiting for the right time to find me again. My first night as a rideshare driver in the city was supposed to be a simple, easy way to make some extra cash. I'd heard all kinds of stories, some wild, some funny, some just downright strange, but I figured I'd be fine. I mean, how bad could it be? So I cleaned out my car, stocked it with a few water bottles and mints, and set out, ready to meet whoever fate threw into my back seat. The first ride of the night came in quickly, a pickup from an apartment complex downtown. The rider turned out to be a young woman in a cocktail dress, clearly having come from a night out. As soon as she slid into the back seat, she started telling me about her date. A complete disaster with a guy who had spent the whole time talking about his crypto investments and amazing workout routine. I chuckled, letting her vent. And by the end of the ride, she was in a much better mood, laughing and thanking me like I'd just given her therapy. Right after she left, I got a request for a pickup a few blocks away. It was two guys in their 20s, clearly hyped up and buzzing with energy. They got in and immediately asked if they could connect to the Bluetooth to play some music. I figured, why not? They blasted a pop song and started singing at the top of their lungs, turning my car into a mobile karaoke booth. At one point, they even tried to get me to sing along, which led to all of us belting out the chorus like a ridiculous trio. I dropped them off at a bar, and they left with a "Thanks, man. You're the best," ringing in my ears. I was starting to think, hey, this is pretty fun. But then things took a turn. Around midnight, I got a request to pick up a passenger from the edge of the city. When I arrived, I found a man in his 40s wearing a sharp suit, standing under a streetlight with an air of quiet intensity. He got in, nodded politely, and gave me an address in an upscale neighborhood. At first, he was silent, just staring out the window, and I figured he wanted to keep to himself. But then he spoke up. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, his voice low, "if you're really doing what you were meant to do?" I wasn't sure how to answer, but he kept going, talking about how he'd spent his whole life chasing money, success, recognition, and now he didn't even know if any of it mattered. I listened, not sure if I was supposed to say something wise or just let him get it all out. By the time I dropped him off, he thanked me, saying, "You might be a better listener than most people I know." He walked away, leaving me with this strange sense of having just played a part in someone's personal revelation. It was almost 2 a.m. when I got my last request of the night, and I was ready to call it quits after this one. The pickup was at a wedding venue on the outskirts of town, and when I arrived, I saw a woman in a bridesmaid dress and heels standing by herself, holding a bouquet that looked a little worse for wear. She got in, and before I could ask how her night had gone, she blurted out, "I just told the best man I've had a crush on him since high school," and he didn't say a word, just walked away. Her face was red, and she looked like she was barely holding back tears. We drove in silence for a bit, and then she laughed, a sad, resigned kind of laugh. I thought this would be my movie moment, you know? Like, he'd realize he felt the same way and sweep me off my feet or something. I wanted to say something comforting, but nothing felt right, so I just let her talk. By the time we reached her apartment, she looked at me with a smile, a little defeated but grateful. "Thanks for not saying anything," she said. "Sometimes, that's exactly what a girl needs." Driving home, I felt like I'd experienced a whole lifetime in one night. Each ride had been a little window into someone else's life. Each person carrying their own hopes, regrets, and stories. I'd heard laughter, heartbreak, frustration, and introspection, all in the span of a few hours. Being a rideshare driver wasn't just about taking people from one place to another. It was about being there in that small, fleeting moment when people needed someone to listen or even just to sit quietly with them in the dark. As I pulled into my driveway, exhausted but strangely satisfied, I realized that I'd probably be back out there tomorrow night. After all, you never know who might need a lift, whether it's to get somewhere on the map or just to feel a little less alone. The coffee shop was packed, and as luck would have it, the only empty seat was right next to a guy typing furiously on his laptop. He had earphones in and a concentrated look, so I tried to quietly slide into the chair without disturbing him. But as I took out my notebook, my phone slipped out of my bag, clattering loudly to the floor. He looked up, pulling out one earphone. "Hey there. Don't worry, it's not like I was on a deadline or anything," he joked, a smirk spreading across his face. I laughed, embarrassed. "Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. Just your average, graceful coffee shop in trance." He closed his laptop, seeming amused. "No problem. I could use a break anyway." He gestured to the pile of papers next to his laptop. "I'm Leo, by the way. Procrastinating grad student." "Nice to meet you, Leo," I said, extending my hand. "I'm Rachel, professional phone dropper and serial coffee shop loiterer." We shook hands, and he grinned. "So, Rachel, what brings you here? Seeking inspiration, or just trying to avoid your own deadline?" "A little of both," I admitted, glancing at my notebook. "Trying to write, but somehow it's harder in a place with Wi-Fi and pastries." "Tell me about it," he said, shaking his head. "I've been trying to finish this paper all day, and I keep getting distracted by everything. Even the guy in line ordering a chai latte seemed fascinating." I laughed, nodding in agreement. Sometimes it feels like anything is more interesting than what you're supposed to be working on. We ended up talking about all the ridiculous ways we procrastinate, from rearranging bookshelves to suddenly deciding it's time to clean the fridge. Leo had a knack for turning even the dullest tasks into something funny, and before I knew it, an hour had flown by. At some point, he noticed me glancing at his laptop screen. "Want to read a sneak preview of my masterpiece?" he asked, tilting the screen toward me. "It's only the first 10 pages, but it's riveting." I pretended to consider it seriously, then nodded. "All right, but only if it's as good as you're hyping it up to be." He handed me his laptop, and I skimmed through his paper, which was on some complex economics topic that honestly went right over my head. But I caught little bits of humor woven in, and I could see he'd put a lot of work into it. I looked up impressed. "Okay, I'll admit, you're making economics seem almost fun." "Almost fun is the highest compliment an economics paper can get," he said, laughing. "Thanks for being my first reader." We chatted for a bit longer, until he glanced at his watch, grimacing. "All right, I should probably get back to work, or I'll be here all night." "Yeah, I should get going too," I said, reluctant to leave. But as I started packing up, he looked at me, a bit hesitant. "Listen, Rachel, this was fun. I mean, way more fun than any other coffee shop distraction I've had. Would you maybe want to grab coffee sometime without the looming threat of deadlines?" I felt a warmth spread through me, nodding before I could overthink it. "I'd like that, as long as you promise not to write any more economics papers during our coffee date." He laughed, pulling out his phone. "Deal." Just light, stimulating conversation about fridge organization and procrastination methods. I added my number to his contacts, grinning. "Sounds like the perfect plan." As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. What had started as a fateful moment of clumsiness had turned into an unexpectedly charming encounter. And as I walked out of the coffee shop, I couldn't wait to see where our caffeine-fueled conversations might lead next. I met Evan at a mutual friend's party, and he was instantly intriguing. He had this easygoing charm, a quick wit, and a sense of humor that kept everyone laughing. We got into a conversation about travel, and he told me about this epic solo trip he'd taken across Europe, full of little detours and spontaneous adventures. It sounded thrilling, like he was the kind of person who could make even the smallest things feel like an adventure. By the end of the night, he convinced me to go out for dinner with him, and I was genuinely excited. On the night of the date, we met at this eclectic little restaurant filled with mismatched furniture and strange artwork. Evan arrived with that same confident grin and immediately launched into a story about how he'd nearly missed the reservation because he'd stopped to help a stray dog find its way home. I couldn't help but laugh. He had this knack for making everything sound like a heartwarming story. We ordered a couple of quirky appetizers, and everything seemed to be going great. Then, about halfway through our meal, he leaned in and gave me this intense look. "So, I have to ask," he said, his voice low and serious. "What's your sign?" I chuckled, thinking he was kidding, but he wasn't. He was staring at me, waiting for an answer like my life depended on it. Virgo," I replied, trying to play along. He nodded slowly, as if I'd just given him the answer to a very complicated math problem. "I knew it," he said, his eyes lighting up. "Virgos have that energy." He didn't elaborate, just kind of gazed at me like he was seeing my aura or something. I gave him a polite smile, figuring it was just a passing comment, but he launched into a long explanation of how astrology had changed his life. He told me he'd recently seen an energy healer who'd done a reading of his birth chart and revealed his true purpose in life. "I'm actually a Cancer," he said, as if that explained everything. "I'm deeply emotional and intuitive. Sensitive, you know?" Trying to keep things light, I nodded and asked if he'd learned anything else from the reading. His face grew even more serious. "She told me I have an old soul," he whispered, like he was sharing a deep, spiritual secret. "She said I've lived many past lives." I was about to make a joke, but he looked so serious that I held back. "That's fascinating," I said, struggling to keep a straight face. He nodded. "I had a feeling you'd understand. Not everyone does." Then he leaned forward, dropping his voice to a dramatic whisper. "I've actually started working on past life regression therapy," he said, like he was revealing some classified information. I blinked, unsure how to respond, but he took my silence as encouragement and went on to explain how he'd been accessing memories of his past selves. "I think I was a knight," he said earnestly. "Like medieval times, I keep having these dreams of swords and battles. It's like I can feel the armor." At that point, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. "That's really something," I managed, trying not to sound sarcastic. But he wasn't done. "I also think I was a painter in France," he added, his voice almost reverent. "In the 1800s, I keep dreaming of this little studio with big windows, like I'm working on some masterpiece. I can practically smell the oil paint." He sighed, looking off into the distance, as if he were recalling a long-lost memory. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, asking if he'd always been into spiritual stuff. He nodded, telling me he'd started awakening a few years ago. "Once you open your mind, you start to see signs everywhere," he explained, his eyes wide with excitement. "Like just last week, I saw a hawk flying right over my car. That's not a coincidence. Hawks are messengers." "Oh, really?" I asked, genuinely curious despite myself. "What was the message?" He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I think it was a sign of transformation," he said, nodding sagely. "Like, I'm about to start a new phase in my journey." He gazed at me with what I can only describe as a mystical intensity. "And I think maybe you're part of that journey." I smiled politely, trying to suppress a giggle. But he looked so earnest that I didn't have the heart to laugh. "I don't know if I'm spiritually ready for all that," I joked, hoping he'd lighten up. But he nodded solemnly. "Not everyone is. It's a lot to handle, this connection to the universe." Just when I thought we might be moving on, he reached into his bag and pulled out a deck of tarot cards. "I brought these just in case," he said, shuffling them dramatically. "Would you be open to a reading?" Before I could answer, he was already dealing out the cards, laying them on the table between our half-eaten appetizers. He stared at the cards with a furrowed brow, muttering to himself. After a moment, he looked up, his face full of concern. "Oh wow," he said, his tone deadly serious. "This is intense." I couldn't help it. I started laughing, but he held up a hand to silence me. "No, really, this is serious. The cards, they're showing me that you have a lot of powerful energy, but it's conflicted. You're struggling between two paths." I tried to look as serious as he did, nodding along as he went on about my spiritual crossroads. He glanced at me, his eyes dark with intensity. "If you're open to it, I could help you find clarity," he said softly. "I know some meditative techniques that might help unlock your third eye." I'll think about it," I replied, trying to keep a straight face. But he wasn't discouraged. He put the cards away and then leaned forward, looking deeply into my eyes. "I feel like we were meant to meet," he whispered. "Like maybe we knew each other in a past life. Do you ever get that feeling?" "Can't say I have," I mumbled, smiling awkwardly. But he just looked at me, nodding as if he were reading my mind. "Sometimes souls find each other across lifetimes," he said, his voice hushed. "I think we're soulmates in some way." At that point, I was torn between wanting to laugh and wanting to run. But he looked so genuinely invested in this idea that I didn't know how to respond. Finally, I gave a polite smile and said, "Wow, that's really something to think about." We wrapped up soon after that, and as we walked outside, he took my hand and said, "Thank you for tonight. I feel like I've made a true spiritual connection." I smiled, thanking him as I gently pulled my hand away. The next day, he sent me a long text. I meditated on our meeting, and I keep seeing flashes of a past life where we were together. It's beautiful. I think we're meant to explore this connection further. Let me know if you'd be open to a joint tarot session. Folded hand sparkles Milky Way. I never replied. For weeks afterward, he kept sending messages, each one more elaborate than the last, detailing visions and dreams he'd had about our shared past lives. Eventually, he stopped, but my friends love the story. Anytime I mention a new date, they joke, "Are you ready to meet your soulmate from the 1800s again?" Now, whenever I see tarot cards or hawks flying by, I can't help but wonder if Evan is out there somewhere, looking up at the stars and reading signs from the universe, hoping for his next great connection. And while I may not believe in past life soulmates, he certainly made that one date unforgettable. It was early spring, one of those nights when the air feels full of possibilities. My best friend, Nate, had invited a few of us to his mom's new condo for a small gathering. She had just downsized after his parents split, and the place was bright and modern. A fresh start for her, I guess. Nate's mom, Claire, had always been a bit of a mystery. Quiet, elegant, and somehow more like an older sister than a mom. She was friendly but distant, always hovering just outside the conversations, observing rather than joining in. That night, after most people had left, Nate crashed on the couch, leaving just me and Claire cleaning up in the kitchen. I could tell she was a little tipsy from the way she laughed, more relaxed than usual. We started talking about random things, her job, Nate's plans, where life had taken all of us since high school. She seemed lonely, hinting at how hard it had been to adjust to single life after so many years. I felt a strange pull toward her, like she was someone I could actually confide in. At one point, she paused, looking at me with this soft, almost wistful expression. "Thank you for always being such a good friend to Nate," she said, touching my arm lightly. Her hand lingered a second too long, and a quiet electricity sparked between us. It felt like a boundary had shifted, some invisible line now blurred. I should have backed away, but instead, I found myself leaning in, drawn by a connection I didn't fully understand. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like we were both testing if this was real. Then it deepened, and all thoughts of boundaries and consequences vanished. We lost ourselves in that moment, moving from the kitchen to her bedroom, completely wrapped up in something we both knew we shouldn't be doing. The next morning, I left before Nate woke up, half hoping she'd text and half hoping I'd never hear from her again. But later that day, she messaged me, saying she wanted to see me to talk. I went, thinking maybe we'd just clear the air, pretend it was a one-time mistake. But when I arrived, we barely even said hello before we were tangled up again, unable to resist. This continued for weeks. Every time we'd meet, the secrecy only added to the intensity. We'd find stolen moments, places where no one would find us, both knowing it couldn't last, but unable to stop. Every time I hung out with Nate, the guilt was a weight pressing down on me, but somehow that weight seemed to vanish when I was with Claire. Eventually, the secret unraveled. Nate came by my place one night when Claire was there, her car parked right out front. He recognized it immediately, putting together all the odd excuses, the sudden absences, the way I'd avoided bringing up his mom in conversation. He confronted us, his face twisted with shock and betrayal. "Are you kidding me?" he demanded, looking between us. His voice was a mix of anger and disbelief, a tone I'd never heard from him before. I tried to explain, to tell him it was a mistake, but the words sounded hollow, even to me. Nate walked out, slamming the door behind him, and I knew that whatever friendship we'd had was over. Claire and I stopped seeing each other immediately. There was no way to keep going after the damage had been done. Now, whenever I think back on that spring, it's with a mix of regret and disbelief. I lost a friend and shattered a family bond over something that should have never happened, a line that once crossed could never be erased. If you told me that one day I'd be selling handmade candles inspired by fictional characters, I would have laughed in disbelief. Candles were always something I'd pick up occasionally at the store, maybe light up on a cozy night in, but they were hardly what I'd call a passion. Now, I'm the owner of Lit Lore, a small candle business that people actually wait in line for, all thanks to a little quarantine boredom and my love of books. It all started during those early, uncertain days of the pandemic. Like so many others, I was stuck inside, restlessly working from home, trying to make the best of all the extra time. As an avid reader, I devoured books at a record pace, sometimes finishing one in a single day. But even that got a little lonely after a while. Without cafes or bookstores to wander through, I started experimenting with new hobbies at home, anything to keep my hands and mind busy. That's when I stumbled upon candle making. I can't even remember what made me try it. Maybe it was a DIY video I saw online, or maybe it was just a whim as I scrolled through endless craft supplies. Either way, I ordered a beginner's kit with wax, wicks, and a few essential oils, thinking it would be a fun way to kill a few hours. I didn't expect to become obsessed. The first candle I made was, well, terrible. The scent was barely there, and I poured way too much wax, so the thing took forever to harden. But the process itself was surprisingly therapeutic. Measuring, melting, pouring, it was calming, almost like meditation. I got better with each batch, experimenting with scents and colors. And before I knew it, I had more candles than I knew what to do with. Then one day, as I was rereading Pride and Prejudice for what must have been the 20th time, I had an idea. What if I tried to capture the essence of a favorite character in a candle? I could imagine it in my head. A candle for Elizabeth Bennet, with earthy notes of lavender and cedar, a touch of rose, and maybe a hint of something unexpected like spice. Something that felt like walking through an English garden on a crisp morning. I got to work right away, mixing scents, adjusting ratios, and finally pouring the wax into a simple mason jar. When it was done, I labeled it Lizzie's Garden, tied a little twine around the top, and set it on my desk. The next time I opened my book, I lit the candle, and somehow, the scent brought me right into her world. I felt connected to the character in a way that went beyond the pages. Excited, I shared a picture of the candle on my Instagram, just for fun. The response was immediate. Friends and followers commented, asking where I'd bought it and whether I'd be making any more. A few people even messaged me, offering to buy one if I was willing to make extras. Encouraged, I decided to whip up a few more and open an Etsy shop to keep things organized. I called it Lit Lore and set up listings for Lizzie's Garden as well as a couple of other character-inspired candles like Darcy's Study, sandalwood and leather with a hint of bergamot, and Pemberley Fields, jasmine and clover. I didn't expect much. Maybe I'd sell a few to friends or to the random internet browser who happened to stumble across my page. But to my complete surprise, my candles sold out within hours. People were commenting, messaging me, and tagging their friends. It seemed I wasn't the only one who found comfort in the idea of bringing beloved fictional worlds to life in a small, scented flame. Over the next few months, Lit Lore took on a life of its own. I added candles inspired by other classic novels like The Secret Garden and Wuthering Heights, and then moved into fantasy and sci-fi realms. Books like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and Dune. Each candle was a small challenge, a puzzle of sorts, to capture the essence of a character or setting in scent form. For Frodo's Shire, I used fresh grass, sage, and a hint of honey. For Hogwarts, I mixed smoky birchwood, old leather, and a dash of cinnamon, aiming for that warm, magical feel. Every candle was a little piece of imagination, and each new release brought more excitement than the last. Soon, my little Etsy shop was blowing up. I was getting orders from across the country, and eventually from other countries, too. I'd get requests for characters I'd never even thought of making, from all kinds of niche fandoms. I started expanding beyond literature, creating candles for movie characters, historical figures, and even mythological gods. It seemed like everyone wanted a candle that connected them to a character or a place they loved. The most rewarding part was hearing from customers. People would send me stories about how the scents helped them feel closer to a favorite character or reminded them of a beloved book from childhood. Some customers would light a Narnia candle to make their reading time feel magical, or a Sherlock study candle when they wanted to work. One customer told me she lit Lizzie's garden every time she sat down to write, and that the scent helped her feel creative and inspired. As demand grew, I moved my operation out of my kitchen and into a small studio space. I upgraded my equipment, hired a part-time assistant, and started releasing seasonal collections. During the holidays, we sold candles inspired by A Christmas Carol, with scents of spice cider, fir trees, and smoky fireplaces. For Halloween, I created a villains line, featuring candles with dark, mysterious scents, notes of charred wood, tobacco, and leather that felt perfectly wicked. Eventually, Lit Lore gained a loyal following, with customers eagerly waiting for each new release. We expanded to include mini bundles that featured sets of smaller candles grouped by theme, like Victorian classics or epic quests. I even started offering custom candles for weddings and special events, where people could choose a scent that matched their favorite book or movie, giving their guests a small piece of their shared story. Looking back, it feels surreal to think that all of this came from one rainy day and a single DIY candle kit. But Lit Lore has become so much more than just a business. It's a community of book lovers, movie buffs, and dreamers, all connected by a shared love of stories and the worlds they create. The candles are small, simple things, but each one is a little portal, a way to slip into another world, if only for a moment. Now, when I walk into my studio, filled with shelves of carefully labeled oils and stacks of orders waiting to go out, I feel this quiet pride. I'm surrounded by the scent of lavender and cedar, sandalwood and spice, scents that bring fictional worlds to life, one candle at a time. And every time I strike a match, light a new candle, and breathe in the story, I know that somehow this path was exactly where I was meant to be. Who knew that one little spark, one small idea, could light up an entire world? We've been best friends for as long as I could remember. The kind of friends who knew each other's families, who spent summers running around the neighborhood until the streetlights came on, who saw each other through every awkward stage of growing up. He was the one person who understood me completely, who could finish my sentences and knew every embarrassing story I'd ever tried to bury. We had a routine, an understanding that was so ingrained it felt like part of who I was. And for years, I never questioned it. Through high school, we were inseparable. He dated other people, I did too, and we talk about every detail, laughing at each other's missteps and cheering each other on. People around us would joke, asking when we'd finally get together, and we'd just roll our eyes. We had something different, something pure, and we weren't about to ruin it by crossing any lines. Then college hit. We went to different schools, and for the first time in years, we weren't right beside each other. We still kept in touch, of course, late-night calls, random texts, visits during breaks. But as time went on, those visits became less frequent, the calls fewer. We were busy living separate lives, and I told myself it was natural that we'd always have our friendship no matter what. But there was a strange ache that crept in, something I couldn't shake but refused to analyze. After graduation, we both moved back home, and it was like nothing had changed. We fell back into our old routines, spending whole weekends together, binge-watching shows, going for long drives, talking about everything and nothing. But this time, there was something different, something unspoken that lingered between us, a tension I couldn't quite put into words. I'd catch him looking at me in a way that felt heavier than before, like he was seeing me in a new light. And I'd feel my heart race, wondering if he felt it too. One night, after a particularly long day, we ended up at my place, sitting on the floor with takeout containers scattered around us, talking about everything we'd been through over the years. He looked at me, his eyes soft and a little hesitant, and asked, "Do you ever think about us?" I froze, my heart pounding, trying to laugh it off. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. Just us. As more than friends." I was stunned, every feeling I'd been pushing down suddenly crashing over me like a wave. I wanted to say something, but the words were tangled up in my throat. Instead, I leaned in, brushing my lips against his, a kiss that felt like both a question and an answer. The next morning, I woke up in his arms, my heart racing with both joy and fear. We hadn't talked about what this meant, hadn't defined anything, and a part of me was terrified that we'd just ruined the one steady thing in my life. But as I lay there, listening to his steady breathing, I realized that there was nowhere else I wanted to be. Over the next few weeks, we tried to navigate this new chapter, both of us hesitant and a little scared but unable to resist the pull between us. Every moment with him felt electric, like we were rediscovering each other in ways we never had before. But it was also terrifying. Every laugh, every touch felt loaded with the question we were both too scared to ask. Could this actually work? One night, as we lay tangled together in the dark, he turned to me, his voice barely a whisper. "What if we mess this up? What if we lose everything?" I felt the same fear echo in my own chest, but I took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'd rather take the risk than spend my life wondering," I said, and I meant it. We both knew this was something we couldn't ignore, something that had been quietly waiting for years. We decided to take it slow, to figure things out one day at a time. There were moments of doubt, times when we questioned if we were doing the right thing. We'd get frustrated, afraid, but every time we'd come back to each other, both of us unwilling to let go of something that felt so rare, so right. It's been almost a year now, and somehow we're still finding our way, still learning how to be both best friends and partners. He's the same person who knows all my quirks, who can make me laugh until my stomach hurts, who remembers the smallest details about me. But now, he's also the person I get to build a life with, the person I can't imagine waking up without. Some days, I catch myself marveling at how we ended up here, how two kids who met by chance grew into this. I used to think love was supposed to be a grand, sweeping thing, full of drama and intensity. But with him, it's simple, it's easy, it's everything I didn't know I wanted. We laugh sometimes about how long it took us to realize what we'd had all along, how many years we spent insisting we were just friends. But maybe that's what makes it so special, so real. We built this love on a foundation of friendship, on years of trust and loyalty, on knowing each other inside out. And now, when people ask if I knew this would happen, I just smile. Because the truth is, maybe I always did. Maybe a part of me always knew that he was the one I'd end up with, even if I couldn't admit it to myself. And now that we're here, I can't imagine it any other way. I never set out to become the plant whisperer of my town. If you told me 5 years ago that people would pay me to teach their houseplants to thrive, I would have laughed and pointed at the dying cactus I used to keep on my desk. That little cactus was so brown and shriveled, my friends nicknamed it Crunchy. Looking back, I realized Crunchy was my first lesson in plant care, or more accurately, in plant neglect. But oddly enough, he was also the catalyst for everything that followed. It all started when I moved into a new apartment. It had big windows, beautiful natural light, and for the first time I thought, hey, maybe I can finally keep a plant alive. Determined not to repeat the Crunchy incident, I headed to the plant shop and asked the staff to help me pick out something easy to care for. They handed me a pot hose, assuring me it was practically indestructible. Skeptical but optimistic, I took it home, named it Perry, and placed it in a cozy spot by the window. Miraculously, Perry survived. Not only that, But he started to grow, vines draping across the windowsill, new leaves unfurling like little green miracles. I couldn't believe it. My friends teased me, saying I'd become a plant mom, and before I knew it, I was back at the plant shop, adding a spider plant and a succulent to my little collection. Then one day, while browsing online, I stumbled across a post about propagating plants, which is essentially a fancy word for growing new plants from cuttings. I was fascinated. With a few simple snips, I could create tiny plant babies from my existing plants. Perry, my original pothose, was more than ready for a trim, so I decided to give it a shot. I snipped a few vines, placed them in water, and waited. A couple of weeks later, roots began to sprout. It felt like magic, like I was somehow coaxing life out of thin air. That's when things spiraled. My kitchen counter became a propagation station, full of jars and cuttings, each growing little roots of its own. Soon, I had more baby plants than I knew what to do with. So I started giving them away to friends, neighbors, my hairdresser, anyone who would take one. Every time I handed someone a new pothose or spider plant, their eyes would light up, and it made me realize something. People love plants, but most of them have no idea where to start. It wasn't long before friends began texting me for plant advice. One of my friends had a sad-looking fiddle leaf fig. Another wanted to know how often to water a snake plant. I became the go-to person for troubleshooting droopy leaves, brown spots, and wilting stems. It was like I'd become the unofficial plant doctor of my friend group. One weekend, my friend Sarah mentioned that her office had a bunch of plants that looked like they were on their last legs. Half joking, I offered to come by and see if I could rescue them. She took me up on it, and before I knew it, I was in her office, surrounded by drooping pothos, a scorched aloe, and a spider plant that looked more like a tumbleweed. I spent the whole afternoon repotting, trimming, and adjusting light conditions. I gave her team a mini workshop on basic plant care, explaining the differences between overwatering and underwatering, and how to tell if a plant needed more sunlight. They were fascinated, taking notes like I was giving a college lecture. By the end of it, they nicknamed me the Plant Whisperer. A few days later, Sarah sent me a text. "Everyone at the office keeps talking about their plants. You should seriously consider doing this as a side gig." I brushed it off as a nice compliment, but her words stuck with me. Could people actually pay for plant advice? The idea simmered in my mind for weeks. Then one evening, fueled by a burst of confidence and maybe a glass of wine, I posted a simple message on social media. Got a plant that's not thriving? The Plant Whisperer is here to help, offering in-home plant care consultations. DM me for details. I didn't expect much, maybe a few friends asking for tips. Instead, my inbox flooded. People were tagging friends, messaging me with desperate pleas for help, and sending photos of their struggling plants. Within a few days, I had a full schedule of consultations. My first client was a woman named Claire who had somehow managed to kill every plant she'd ever owned. Her latest victim was a monstera that looked more like a sad stick than the vibrant, leafy plant it was meant to be. I walked her through the basics, adjusting her watering schedule, showing her how to check the soil, and giving her tips on how to position it for the best light. By the time I left, she was practically glowing with excitement. Word spread fast. I created an official Plant Whisperer Instagram page, posted tips, before and after photos, and stories from my plant rescues. People loved it. They'd send me messages about their plant success stories, or tag me in photos of their revitalized green friends. I even started getting messages from plant shops, asking if I'd be interested in hosting workshops. One of the most surprising gigs came from a real estate agent. She asked if I'd green up a few homes before showings to make them feel more inviting. I went in, set up beautiful plant displays, and made sure everything looked fresh and alive. The homes felt cozier, more lived in, and the buyers loved it. Soon, staging houses with plants became a regular part of my business. Eventually, I quit my day job and opened a small studio. I turned it into a plant lover's paradise, with walls of hanging plants, shelves lined with pots of succulents, ferns, and trailing ivy, and a big, open space for workshops. I started offering Plant 101 classes where people could learn the basics of plant care, propagation, and even how to make their own terrariums. The workshops were a hit, attracting everyone from seasoned plant parents to people who'd never kept anything green alive in their lives. I even started selling my plant babies, the little cuttings I'd propagated from my original plants. Each one came with a care guide and a small tag with its name. Yes, I named every single one. People love the personal touch, and it wasn't long before my little propagated cuttings had found homes all across town. As my business grew, so did my ambitions. I launched an online store with plant care kits, propagation stations, and custom soil blends. I even started a plant doctor hotline where people could send me photos and questions about their plants for quick advice. It became a community, a place where people shared their plant successes, funny stories, and sometimes their plant failures too. Today, my studio is buzzing with life, both human and botanical. Every day, people come in, browse the plants, chat about their collections, and swap tips. I get messages from people who tell me they've started growing their own plant babies, inspired by my story, and there's nothing that makes me happier. Being the plant whisperer isn't something I ever planned, but somehow it feels like exactly where I'm meant to be. My life has become rooted, literally, in helping people connect with nature, even if it's just through a single potted fern or a little cactus named Crunchy. So, if you ever feel lost, or like you're looking for something to ground you, maybe give plant care a shot. Because sometimes the most unexpected things can bloom into something beautiful, one leaf at a time. All right, this one's about my friend Jordan, who worked as a concierge at a luxury hotel downtown. He thought he'd seen it all: last-minute yacht rentals, guests requesting bowls of only green M&Ms, even the occasional emergency helicopter ride to avoid city traffic. But one evening, he got a call that would take guest requests to an entirely new level. It was just after 11 p.m., and Jordan was about to wrap up his shift when the phone rang. The guest on the other end, speaking in a low, urgent tone, told him he needed something very specific. Jordan braced himself, expecting another eccentric demand. But then the guest said, "I need a bag of unsalted organic peanuts. Not roasted, raw, and I need them as soon as possible." Jordan tried to explain that the hotel kitchen might not have exactly that, but the guest cut him off. "No substitutions. It has to be exactly that," he insisted, his voice sounding almost desperate. After a bit of back and forth, Jordan gave in. He promised he'd figure it out, though he had no idea where he'd find raw, unsalted, organic peanuts in the middle of the night. So there he was, running around the city, hitting every 24-hour grocery store and bodega he could think of. After nearly an hour, he finally tracked down a small health food store that had exactly what the guest wanted. Triumphant and exhausted, Jordan grabbed the bag and rushed back to the hotel, eager to finally end this bizarre mission. When he got to the guest suite, he knocked, expecting a quick thank you. Instead, the guest opened the door, wide-eyed, and snatched the bag with an almost maniacal grin. Before Jordan could even ask what all the fuss was about, the guest bolted past him, clutching the peanuts like they were made of gold, and dashed down the hallway. Jordan stood there, stunned, and then curiosity got the best of him. He followed at a distance, watching as the guest took a sharp turn down a side corridor that led to one of the hotel's massive banquet halls. Jordan peeked around the corner, just in time to see the guest stop in front of a large, open window. And there, perched on the ledge outside, was a raccoon, staring at the man with expectant eyes. Jordan watched in disbelief as the guest opened the bag of peanuts and, with an almost reverent smile, began feeding them one by one to the raccoon, who delicately took each nut with its little hands. The man muttered something Jordan couldn't quite hear, almost like he was talking to an old friend. Unable to contain himself, Jordan finally stepped forward and said, "Is there anything else you need tonight, sir?" The guest turned, startled, but then just shrugged. "Nah, we're good," he said, nodding at the raccoon. Just didn't want him to go hungry. After that, Jordan made it back to his desk, still half convinced he'd dreamed the whole thing. He never saw the guest or the raccoon again, but every time he tells the story, he finishes with, "You can't make this stuff up. Some people are just on a whole different wavelength." And he's got a point. Because who else would insist on unsalted organic peanuts at midnight for a wild raccoon waiting outside their luxury suite? This happened last winter, during one of those bone-chilling storms that turns everything into a blur of snow and silence. I was on a late-night drive home from visiting a friend out of town, tired and already regretting not booking a hotel for the night. The snow was falling so thick that the road ahead disappeared, my headlights barely cutting through the wall of white. It was reckless, I knew, but I just wanted to be home. After nearly an hour of inching along at a snail's pace, I started to worry that I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. Nothing looked familiar, and the snow was piling up so quickly that it erased any sign of the road. Just as I was beginning to panic, I spotted a faint glow up ahead, like a beacon. As I got closer, I realized it was a small building, nestled by the side of the road, its windows softly lit. The sign above the door read, "The Wayfarer's Rest." I pulled up, heart pounding with relief. The place looked like an old inn from another era, cozy and welcoming, its walls glowing warmly from within. I figured I'd stop in, ask for directions, maybe wait out the worst of the storm. When I stepped inside, I felt like I'd entered another world. The interior was beautiful. Old wooden beams, a crackling fireplace, and a faint scent of pine and cinnamon that filled the air. A few people were seated around the fire, each with a mug in hand, talking softly as if they were old friends. The innkeeper, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a calm, knowing smile, came over to greet me. "Welcome, traveler," she said, her voice soothing. "You look like you could use a rest." I nodded, brushing snow from my coat. "I was just looking for directions. I think I got turned around in the storm." She smiled gently, as if she'd heard this before. "The Wayfarer's Rest has a way of finding those who need it most. Why don't you stay for a bit? Warm up?" Her words felt comforting, like an invitation to let go of my worries for a moment. So I nodded, grateful, and she led me to a small table near the fire. The guests around the room all looked up and gave me friendly nods, like they'd been waiting for me to arrive. I didn't recognize any of them, but they each had that look of familiarity, as if we'd met in some other life. The innkeeper brought me a steaming cup of tea, and I sipped it, feeling warmth spread through me. After a while, I started talking to the man seated next to me. He was an older gentleman with kind eyes and a deep, calming voice. We started chatting about life, the way you do with strangers when there's no pressure to impress. I found myself telling him about my life, things I hadn't shared with anyone in ages. My work, the pressures I felt, the restlessness I couldn't shake, even the relationship I'd recently ended, leaving me with a quiet, unspoken ache. He listened, nodding thoughtfully. When I was finished, he looked at me, his gaze gentle but serious. "You're searching for something, aren't you?" I paused, taken aback. I guess I am." He smiled. "Sometimes we don't realize that what we're searching for has been with us all along, just hidden under everything else. Sometimes it takes getting a little lost to find it again." I didn't know what to say. His words struck something deep in me, as if he'd pulled aside a curtain I hadn't realized was there. I'd been so caught up in my own worries, my own sense of being adrift, that I hadn't stopped to consider that maybe the answers were already within me. The other guests nodded as if they'd had similar revelations. Each one seemed to have their own story, their own quiet search for something they'd lost along the way. One woman spoke about how she'd spent years in a high-powered job, sacrificing her happiness for success, only to realize she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt joy. Another man admitted that he'd been trying to outrun grief after losing his wife, traveling from place to place, hoping distance would soften the pain. Each story resonated with me, and I felt this strange, shared sense of humanity among us. We were all wayfarers, lost in our own ways, finding comfort in the warmth of the fire and the kindness of strangers. As the night wore on, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. We sat there, sharing our stories, our fears, our regrets, and as we did, it felt like we were letting go of something heavy, something that had been weighing us down for years. At some point, I must have drifted off. I remember the soft murmur of voices, the warmth of the fire, the gentle clink of cups as the guests toasted to each other's journeys. When I woke up, it was early morning, and the inn was silent. The other guests were gone, and the fire had burned low, casting a gentle glow over the room. The innkeeper was the only one there, tidying up. She noticed I was awake and came over, her smile gentle. "Thank you," I said, feeling a deep gratitude I couldn't fully explain. For everything. She nodded, as if she understood exactly what I meant. Safe travels, she said, pressing something cool and small into my hand. Remember, the way is always there, even when you feel lost. When I looked down, I saw a small, silver compass lying in my palm, its needle pointing north. I looked up to thank her, but she had already turned away, disappearing into the quiet of the inn. I stepped outside into the morning light, blinking against the brightness. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed, the snow glittering under the early sun. I made my way back to the road, and to my surprise, I recognized my surroundings instantly. Somehow, I'd found my way back without trying. I drove home, that morning feeling different, lighter somehow, as if the things that had weighed on me for so long had loosened their grip. The memory of that night stayed with me, vivid and surreal, like something from a dream, but the compass in my hand was proof that it had been real. Since that night, I've kept the compass with me as a reminder. Whenever I feel lost or unsure, I hold it and remember the warmth of the inn, the quiet conversations, the strangers who felt like old friends. And somehow, it reminds me that no matter how far I wander, there's always a way back to myself. And every so often, on late, quiet nights, I find myself wondering if the Wayfarer's Rest is still out there, waiting by the side of a lonely road for someone else who's a little lost, a little weary, and in need of a place to rest, if only for a while. I was standing in line at the movie theater, clutching my ticket and trying to decide between popcorn and candy. It was one of those solo movie nights where I just wanted to lose myself in a story. But apparently, the guy in front of me was having an existential crisis about his own snack choices. Popcorn or nachos? He muttered to himself, then glanced over at me, as if I might hold the answers to life's great questions. I smiled, happy to have an excuse to chat. Easy choice. Popcorn is a classic. Nachos are just asking for a mess. He laughed, nodding. Good point. Besides, I don't want to be that guy crunching nachos during the quiet scenes. He turned back to the counter and ordered a massive bucket of popcorn. Then, as an afterthought, he turned to me again. Can I get you something? For being my snack consultant. Oh, no need, I said, but he was already ordering a bag of M&Ms and handing them to me before I could protest. I insist, he said with a grin. Thanks for guiding me toward better snack etiquette. I'm Alex, by the way. Rachel, I replied, taking the M&Ms with a smile. Thanks, Alex. I'll make sure to savor each one, popcorn style, for the full experience. We both laughed, and as we headed toward the theater, he glanced down at my ticket. You're here for the Time Traveler's Detective too? Yeah, I said, surprised. I was half worried I'd be the only one. It's kind of niche. Same. I love a good mind-bending mystery, and everyone else I know thinks I'm crazy for it, he said, rolling his eyes. As we walked into the theater together, he motioned toward the seats. So, want to join me? You know, for commentary and snack analysis? I laughed, feeling an instant ease around him. Only if you're okay with whispered debates about the plot twists. We settled in, sharing popcorn and M&Ms and exchanging occasional whispers about the movie. When the plot took a wild twist, we both gasped at the same time, then stifled our laughter, earning a few side eyes from nearby viewers. It was like watching the movie with an old friend, except we'd only met 10 minutes ago. When the credits rolled, we both sat there for a moment, letting the ending sink in. Finally, Alex looked over at me, wide-eyed. Did that just happen? I mean, was the detective also his own grandpa? I burst out laughing, nodding. I think so. I don't even know, but it was amazing and completely ridiculous. We wandered out of the theater, still rehashing the most absurd plot points, neither of us wanting the night to end. He hesitated as we reached the parking lot, shifting the popcorn bucket to his other hand. So, Rachel, he began, looking a bit nervous. Would you be up for another movie night sometime? I mean, I think we make a solid snack and commentary team. I grinned, feeling a thrill of excitement. I'd love that, but only if you let me pick the next one. He held out his phone with a smile. Deal. I'm trusting you to pick something equally mind-bending. I added my number, feeling an unexpected spark. As I walked to my car, I couldn't stop smiling. What was supposed to be a quiet night at the movies had turned into a spontaneous adventure, and I had a feeling it was only the beginning. I didn't want to go out. It was one of those late autumn evenings when all you want to do is curl up with a book and a blanket. But my roommate Kate burst into my room with a grin and a glittery dress in hand, insisting I join her for just one drink at a jazz bar across town. After a long week, the idea of jazz, dim lights, and maybe a cocktail or two sounded bearable, so I reluctantly got dressed, telling myself I'd only stay an hour. The bar was tucked down a side street, one of those cozy, candlelit places that felt like stepping back in time. The room was filled with soft jazz, tables crowded with people leaning close to talk, the smell of whiskey and old wood in the air. Kate was already chatting with a group of friends, but I hung back, finding a quiet spot near the bar where I could soak in the scene without needing to talk to anyone. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting at the end of the bar, sketching on a small notepad, completely absorbed in whatever he was drawing. He looked up, caught my gaze, and gave me a lopsided smile that made something in my chest flutter. Before I could think too hard about it, he walked over, introducing himself as Sam, his voice warm and a little rough like he'd been talking over loud music all night. We fell into conversation easily, surprising me. He told me he was an artist, and he had this way of talking about his work that made me feel like I could see his world through his eyes. His passion was infectious, and I found myself opening up too, telling him things I wouldn't usually share with a stranger. He listened with a kind of focus that made me feel truly seen, like every word mattered. At some point, he asked if I wanted to see his sketchbook. I agreed, and he flipped through pages filled with cityscapes, portraits, moments he'd captured in quick, messy lines that somehow felt alive. He handed me the sketchbook to look at more closely, and for a while, we sat in silence, sharing something that felt oddly intimate. The music in the bar faded into a slow, melancholy tune, and Sam held out his hand, asking if I wanted to dance. Normally, I would have laughed it off, but something about the moment felt right, so I took his hand. We swayed together in the dim light, his hand warm on my back, and for a moment, it was like the rest of the world didn't exist. There was a tenderness to it, a feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be, and I found myself leaning into him, savoring the closeness. When the song ended, we lingered for a moment, both of us caught in the quiet magic of the night. Then he looked at me, his eyes soft and searching, and asked if I'd like to take a walk. I nodded, feeling that rush of excitement again, and we slipped out into the cool, crisp night, leaving the bar and its warmth behind. We wandered through the empty streets, talking about dreams, the way certain songs make us feel, and all the little things that usually get lost in day-to-day life. There was an honesty to it, a vulnerability I hadn't felt in a long time, and I found myself sharing thoughts I didn't even know I'd been holding on to. He told me about his favorite places in the city, the corners he liked to sketch, the details he'd noticed that most people missed. At one point, we stopped under a streetlight, and he turned to me, his expression serious but gentle. He took my hand, brushing his thumb over my knuckles, and when he leaned in, his kiss was soft, lingering, like a question and an answer all at once. I felt my heart race, but there was a calmness to it too, like this moment had been waiting for us all along. We ended up back at his place, a small studio filled with paintings, sketches, and the smell of oil paint. It was messy, warm, with canvases leaning against every wall, the kind of space that felt like an extension of him. We sat on the floor, wrapped in an oversized blanket, talking in whispers as the night deepened around us. The hours melted away in a mix of laughter, quiet touches, and moments that felt like they were just for us, pieces of time we didn't have to share with anyone else. By the time dawn started to creep through the window, we both drifted off, my head resting on his shoulder, his hand still wrapped around mine. I woke up to the soft light streaming in, illuminating the room in a gentle, golden glow. Sam was still asleep, and for a moment, I let myself watch him, memorizing the quiet peacefulness of his face. When he woke up, he gave me a sleepy smile, and there was something bittersweet in his eyes, like he knew this moment was as fragile as I did. We shared coffee in comfortable silence, both of us feeling the weight of the night, and when it was time for me to go, He walked me to the door, his hand lingering on mine for just a second longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, and I knew he meant it for everything. The conversation, the closeness, the night we'd shared. I gave him a small, sad smile, knowing I'd probably never see him again, but that somehow, it didn't make the memory any less meaningful. As I walked home in the early morning light, I felt a mix of emotions, a quiet joy for the night we'd shared, and a bittersweet ache knowing it was already slipping into the past. I knew this wasn't something meant to last, that some moments are perfect because they're fleeting, but a part of me still wished it could have been more. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about Sam, the warmth of his hand, the softness of his voice, the way he'd looked at me like he was seeing something beyond the surface. It was a reminder of what it feels like to connect, to let someone in if only for a moment. And while I knew that night would become just a memory, it left me with a quiet hope, a sense of what's possible, of the beauty that exists in the most unexpected places. That night with Sam will always be a little piece of magic, a memory I carry with me, a reminder of the kind of connection I'm still searching for. Until then, I'll hold on to that night, grateful for the warmth, the laughter, and the glimpse into a world where two strangers can share something real, even if only for a few perfect hours. Here's the tale of the great parking lot siege, the prank that had the whole school gridlocked and somehow led to one of the most unforgettable days of high school. By senior year, we were pros at spotting every little injustice our school put us through, and the parking lot situation was by far the worst. The school only had enough spaces for about half of us, so it was a daily scramble to grab a spot. And if you were late, you'd end up parking what felt like a mile away. So, naturally, someone proposed the ultimate revenge prank. Let's take over the parking lot. And when I say take over, I mean we were going to blockade the entire thing, student style. The plan was simple, but ambitious. We'd get there before dawn, create a barricade at every entrance, and hold a tailgate party for the seniors. That morning, about 30 of us gathered at a nearby 24-hour diner just after 4 a.m., bundled up and barely awake. Everyone brought their cars, their trucks, and even a few lawn chairs. Someone had a portable grill, another brought donuts, and a few people had those little Bluetooth speakers so we could blast music once we got set up. By 5 a.m., we were parked, our cars strategically lined up to block every entry point. We spread out across the main lot, taking up as many spaces as we could, setting up lawn chairs in open spots, and dancing like we owned the place. It was absolutely hilarious. Some of us were tossing a football, others were grilling breakfast sandwiches, and a few people had even brought giant banners that read, "Seniors Only," and "Class of 2023 takes back the lot." The first teachers started arriving around 6:30, and they did double takes as they pulled in, completely bewildered. One of them, Mr. Langston, just honked and laughed, giving us a thumbs up before parking on the grass nearby. But soon enough, the principal showed up, and his face was a mix of disbelief and barely contained frustration. He got out of his car, walked over to us with his hands on his hips, and shouted, "What is this?" One of the seniors, Brad, always the class clown, just shrugged and said, "Morning tailgate, Mr. P. Didn't you get the memo?" The principal tried to stay calm, saying things like, "This is highly disruptive, and you need to clear these spaces immediately." But Brad and a few others just kept handing him coffee and donuts, nodding like he was just another guest at our party. A few teachers even joined in, sipping coffee and laughing as we explained the rules of the great parking lot siege. When the first wave of juniors and sophomores showed up, they just stared, completely confused as to why they couldn't get into the lot. A few tried inching their cars around the barricade, but we just grinned, holding our spots firm. Word got around fast, and before long, the entire lot was filled with honking cars waiting to get in, everyone rubbernecking to see the senior tailgate in action. Eventually, the principal decided he'd had enough. He got on his megaphone and gave us a countdown. "Seniors, you have 5 minutes to clear the lot or face serious consequences." But right as he finished, the marching band, who had caught wind of our prank, showed up in full uniform and started playing "Eye of the Tiger" as a dramatic background anthem. At that point, even the principal had to smile, throwing his hands up in defeat. We slowly packed up, but only after one last victory lap around the lot, honking and waving while everyone cheered. The rest of the day, teachers kept stopping us in the halls, some trying to be stern, but most cracking up, telling us it was the best prank they'd seen. By lunch, the whole school knew about the great parking lot siege, and the underclassmen were already plotting to try and outdo us someday. To this day, I still remember the look on our principal's face as we handed him a donut, like he was watching his well-ordered school slip right out of his grasp for one glorious morning. And the best part? Every senior got an early dismissal that day as a reward for participating in school spirit, which was the administration's way of saying they'd been thoroughly outplayed. I'd almost turned back twice on my way there. It was late, I'd had a long day, and this particular party was full of people I barely knew, hosted by a friend of a friend in a part of town I rarely ventured to. But I'd promised myself I'd get out of my comfort zone more, so I kept going, telling myself I'd stay for one drink, make a few polite rounds, and leave. The place was alive with music and laughter. People crowded into every corner, leaning over counters and lounging on couches. I felt a bit like an outsider, nursing a drink in the kitchen and watching as everyone else seemed to settle into easy conversation. But then, through the shifting crowd, I noticed someone. He was sitting alone on the stairs, sipping from a beer bottle, his eyes scanning the room with an expression that was both curious and detached. He had this easy, relaxed vibe, a quiet confidence that made him seem like he didn't need to be anywhere else but here. He looked up, caught my eye, and gave me a small smile, an invitation, maybe, or just a shared recognition that neither of us fully belonged here. Before I knew it, I'd made my way over, and we started talking. His name was Julian, and he had this way of making even the simplest conversation feel layered, interesting, like there was always something more to be uncovered. He was funny, quick with dry, witty remarks, and I found myself laughing more than I had in days. We moved away from the crowd, finding a quieter spot by the window where the music was muffled and the city lights stretched out below us. He told me he'd just moved here, that he was still trying to figure out his place in the city. I could hear a hint of restlessness in his voice, and it resonated with something in me, like we were both wandering souls searching for something we couldn't quite name. The conversation turned deeper, somehow, as if the night had given us permission to peel back layers we didn't usually share with strangers. He told me about his love for photography, the way he saw the world in snapshots, moments he wanted to capture before they slipped away. I told him about my dream to travel, the places I'd only seen in books, and he listened with a focus that made me feel like my words were worth something. At some point, he suggested we step outside for some air, and I followed him into the quiet street. The city was hushed, the occasional car passing by, but mostly it was just us and the cool night air. He walked close beside me, our shoulders brushing, and I could feel an electricity building between us, a charge that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. We ended up at a small park nearby, sitting on a bench under a streetlight, the quiet wrapping around us like a blanket. There was a pause, a moment where words didn't feel necessary, and then he looked at me, his gaze soft and intent. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine, and I felt a shiver run through me. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like he was inviting me into something, a shared silence that spoke more than any conversation. When he leaned in, his kiss was soft, unhurried, and somehow perfect, like it had been waiting for us all along. My heart raced, but there was a calmness to it too, a feeling that this was exactly where I was meant to be. We stayed like that for a while, wrapped up in each other, letting the night hold us in its quiet embrace. Eventually, he suggested we go back to his place, and it felt so natural, like the next chapter in a story we'd already started writing together. His apartment was small and cluttered, with art books piled everywhere and a camera resting on the coffee table. We sat on the floor, sharing stories about the things we loved and feared, trading secrets that felt like small, precious gifts. The night melted away in laughter, soft words, and quiet moments where we didn't need to say anything at all. We fell asleep wrapped up in each other, his hand resting on my back, his breathing steady and warm. In the morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting everything in a golden glow. He was still asleep, his face softened in the light, and I watched him for a moment, feeling a strange mix of joy and sadness, knowing this was a memory I'd carry with me. When he woke up, he smiled at me, that same quiet, understanding smile he'd given me at the party, and we shared coffee in silence, both of us aware that the magic of the night was already slipping away. He walked me to the door, his hand lingering on mine, and I felt the bittersweet ache of knowing that sometimes the most beautiful things aren't meant to last. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with a sincerity that made my heart ache. I gave him a small smile, knowing that we both understood the unspoken goodbye. And then I left, stepping out into the bright morning, carrying the memory of him with me like a secret. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about that night, the connection we'd shared, the feeling of being seen and understood in a way that felt both rare and familiar. It left me with a quiet hope, a sense of possibility that maybe one day I'd find that kind of connection again, one that could last beyond the dawn. Until then, I'll hold on to that memory of Julian, a little piece of magic to remind me of what's out there, waiting in the quiet, unexpected moments that make life feel beautiful. It was late on a Thursday night, and I was taking a cab home after an exhausting work event, watching the city lights blur past as the cab wound through empty streets. Just as we were about to reach my apartment, the driver, a quiet, older man with a weathered face, took a sudden turn down a street I didn't recognize. I sat up, confused. This isn't my street," I said, a little uneasy. He looked at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes calm. "You're close, but I just thought you might need a moment at the Midnight Cafe," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Before I could ask what he meant, we pulled up in front of a tiny building nestled between two old brick warehouses. Its sign was barely visible in the dim streetlight. The Midnight Cafe, written in faded gold letters. I stared at it, feeling a strange pull. I wasn't sure why, but something about the place made me want to go inside. So I paid the driver, who simply nodded and wished me a good night, and I stepped out, shivering in the cool air. I half expected the cafe to be closed, but to my surprise, I saw a faint light spilling out through the frosted glass of the door. When I walked in, the place was exactly as you'd imagine an old cafe at midnight to be. It was dimly lit, with a warm, amber glow from mismatched lamps on each table. There were maybe 5 or 6 tables, and each one had a small brass teapot and a cup already waiting. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and something else, something faintly floral that I couldn't quite place. I looked around, and though the cafe was empty, I didn't feel alone. The walls were lined with old photographs in simple frames, people smiling, laughing, caught in everyday moments. I couldn't explain it, but the place felt alive, as if it were quietly observing me, waiting to see what I would do. Just as I was about to turn around, a woman appeared from behind the counter. She was older, with dark skin, deep-set eyes, and a scarf wrapped around her head in elegant layers. She smiled at me, the kind of smile that made you feel both seen and understood. "Welcome," she said warmly. "Please take a seat. We've been expecting you." I felt my stomach flip. "Expecting me? How?" She just smiled, that calm, knowing look that didn't need any words. I took a seat at the table nearest to me, and she poured tea into the cup, its steam curling up in soft tendrils. "What is this place?" I asked, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and comfort. "It's a cafe for those who need a pause," she said simply, setting the teapot down. "A place to rest, to reflect, or perhaps to remember." I sipped the tea, feeling its warmth spread through me. It tasted faintly of spices and flowers, with a hint of something I couldn't quite identify, something nostalgic, like a scent that reminded you of a long-lost memory. I sat in silence, letting the warmth and quiet seep into me, feeling my mind calm in a way it hadn't in ages. After a while, she brought over a small journal and a pen, setting them on the table beside my cup. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we carry thoughts we haven't had a chance to voice. This is a place where they can be written down if you like." I opened the journal, its pages blank and waiting. I hesitated, unsure of what to write. But as I sat there, thoughts began to rise to the surface, ones I hadn't allowed myself to think about for a long time. I wrote about the loneliness I'd been feeling, the weight of trying to live up to expectations, and the quiet fear that maybe I was losing touch with who I really was. The words flowed out of me like a confession, filling page after page with things I hadn't dared to say out loud. I poured out my worries about my career, my relationships, the dreams I'd once had, and the quiet sadness that I couldn't shake. When I finally looked up, the woman was sitting across from me, her eyes kind and understanding. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "It's a heavy thing, carrying so much on your own," she said softly. "But you don't have to hold on to it all. Sometimes you can leave pieces of it behind." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I quickly looked away, embarrassed. How do I let it go?" I asked, barely able to voice the question. She squeezed my hand gently, as if she understood. "There's no single answer," she said, her voice low and soothing. "But you start by allowing yourself to feel it fully, without judgment. And then little by little, you release it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She gave me a gentle smile and rose from the table, leaving me with the journal and my thoughts. I sat there a while longer, breathing in the warmth of the tea, the smell of the spices, the quiet of the cafe. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to have all the answers. When I finally left, she handed me the journal. "Take it with you," she said. "And remember, you're welcome here anytime you need to pause." I nodded, feeling a strange gratitude I couldn't put into words. As I stepped outside, I turned to look back, wanting to remember the details of that cozy, quiet space. But the cafe looked different, almost faded, as if it were retreating into the shadows. The lights dimmed, and then, without warning, it vanished, leaving only the dark street behind. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I felt the journal in my hands, its pages filled with my own handwriting, proof that it had been real. Since that night, I've kept the journal close. Whenever life starts to feel overwhelming, I take it out, read through the words I wrote that night, and remember the comfort of that little cafe, the quiet wisdom of the woman who seemed to understand everything I couldn't say. And on the nights when I'm out late, driving through the quiet city streets, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a warm, golden light spilling out from an unmarked building, a light that disappears as soon as I look closer. I know I may never find the Midnight Cafe again, but I like to think it's still out there, waiting for someone else who needs a place to pause, a place to rest, and a moment to remember that they're not alone. It was one of those evenings where the city felt a little too big and my apartment felt a little too small. The streets were buzzing, people moving around me like they all knew exactly where they were going, like they were sure of every step. I, on the other hand, felt like I was floating through my own life, watching it happen rather than living it. I had a good job, a nice enough place, friends I could call on if I felt lonely. But lately, I'd been haunted by this sense that something was missing, some part of myself that I couldn't quite name. That was when I found the book. I was wandering through a used bookstore tucked away on a quiet street. It was dimly lit, with tall, dusty shelves stacked haphazardly with novels, guides, atlases, and books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just browsing, letting my fingers drift over the worn spines. Then, on a narrow shelf in the back corner, I spotted it. A small leather-bound book, old but surprisingly well-preserved. It had no title on the cover, just a tiny golden key embossed in the lower corner. I pulled it out, intrigued, and flipped it open. Inside, on the very first page, was a single handwritten note. For the one who was searching. The words seemed to reach out to me, as if they'd been written for me personally. I felt a strange thrill, like the book was speaking directly to something inside me. I glanced around, almost expecting someone to be watching, as if they knew I'd found it. But there was no one there, just me and that quiet, musty little shop. I took the book to the counter where the shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with a warm smile and thick glasses, looked down at it and nodded knowingly. "Ah," he said, tapping the cover. "A good find." I laughed a little nervously. "It seems kind of special." He just smiled. "It is. I've had it here for years, waiting for the right person to pick it up. Looks like today's the day. I left the shop feeling a little odd, clutching the book like it was something fragile and precious. I wasn't sure what to make of the shopkeeper's words, but part of me was itching to open it, to see what else was inside. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I curled up on the couch and opened the book again. As I turned the pages, I found more handwritten notes scattered between blank pages. Some were simple observations like, "Listen to the rain. It holds more wisdom than you think." Others were questions, prompts that felt almost like invitations. When did you last feel truly alive? If you could do anything, without fear or doubt, what would it be? Where are you holding back? I felt an ache as I read them. The kind of ache that comes from knowing there are truths buried inside you that you've been too afraid to face. The questions felt intensely personal, but they were gentle, too, like a friend nudging you towards something you were meant to see. I started writing in the book, answering the questions as honestly as I could. At first, it felt awkward, like I was exposing parts of myself I didn't even know were there. But the more I wrote, the more I found myself sinking into the process, letting the words flow out, unfiltered and real. I wrote about my fears, the fear of failing, of wasting time, of living a life that felt small. I wrote about the things I wanted to do, but had pushed aside for someday. The dreams I'd shelved because they didn't fit into the life I thought I was supposed to live. And as I wrote, I felt like I was peeling back layers of myself, finding a version of me I hadn't seen in years. By the time I reached the middle of the book, I felt like I was on the edge of something big. There was an entry halfway through, written in the same handwriting as the rest, that said simply, "Take a step, any step, see where it leads." The words felt like a command, a challenge. I didn't know what step I was supposed to take, but I couldn't ignore the pull I felt to do something, anything, that would shake me out of my routine. The next morning, on a whim, I decided to take a train to the coast. I didn't have a plan, just a vague sense that I needed to be somewhere open and wild, somewhere that would remind me of how vast the world really was. I packed a small bag, brought the book with me, and boarded the train, watching the city fall away as we moved toward the shore. When I arrived, I walked along the beach, feeling the wind in my hair, the sand cold and wet under my feet. I found a spot on the dunes and sat there for a long time, watching the waves roll in and out, their rhythm steady and constant. It felt like they were reminding me that life moves in cycles, that sometimes you have to let go to make room for something new. I pulled out the book and turned to the next page, wondering what message or prompt might be waiting for me. There was a new note, one that hadn't been there before. I was sure of it, because I'd read through every page the night before. But now, in that same elegant handwriting, were 4 words I hadn't seen before. "Trust yourself to begin." I stared at it, feeling a chill go through me. It was like the book knew me better than I knew myself, like it had been waiting for me to reach this point, to be ready to see those words. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the sea, letting those words sink in. All my life, I've been waiting for some sign, something to tell me I was ready, that I had permission to start living the life I wanted. But here, sitting on that windswept beach with only the sound of the waves and the words in that mysterious book, I realized that the only permission I needed was my own. When I finally left the beach, I felt like I was walking with purpose, my mind clear, my heart steady. I didn't have everything figured out, but I knew I was ready to start trying. I kept the book close, carrying it with me as a reminder to trust myself, to take those steps even when they felt uncertain. In the weeks that followed, I began making changes, small at first. A weekend painting class, a solo hike, even calling up an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Each change felt like a thread unraveling, revealing parts of myself I hadn't seen in a long time. Then one morning I opened the book and found that it was completely blank. The pages that had been filled with notes and prompts were now empty, as if they'd never existed. I flipped through it over and over, trying to find even a trace of the writing that had guided me. But there was nothing, just the blank, slightly yellowed pages. At first, I panicked, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I realized that maybe this was the book's final message, that I didn't need its words anymore, that I could find my own. Now, the book sits on my shelf, empty but cherished, a reminder of the journey it took me on. And every time I find myself slipping back into old routines, I pull it down, run my fingers over its blank pages, and remember that simple but powerful truth it taught me. That sometimes the only thing holding us back is our own doubt, and that the life we're searching for is often just a single step away, waiting for us to trust ourselves enough to be. My friend Nate worked as a night shift delivery driver for a specialty florist that catered to high-end clients. It wasn't your typical bouquet shop. This place did custom arrangements for everything from exclusive parties to private proposals, and they were known for meeting any request, no matter how bizarre. But one night, he got an order that left him questioning the very nature of his job. It was around 1 a.m., and Nate was getting ready to clock out when the manager called him back. "We've got a rush order," she said, handing him an address with no explanation. Nate groaned, exhausted, but figured it would be just another last-minute romantic gesture, or maybe a VIP client wanting a bit of late-night glamour. The order itself was unusual. 500 red roses. Nothing else, just a mountain of red roses. He loaded them into the van, filling it to the brim with the overwhelming scent of fresh flowers, and set off to the address, which turned out to be an old mansion on the edge of the city. The whole place looked like it had been plucked from a Gothic novel, with ivy covering the walls and iron gates that creaked as he pulled up. He knocked on the door, and after a few tense seconds, it swung open to reveal an elderly man with piercing eyes and a suit that looked like it belonged to a different century. The man glanced at the flowers and nodded. "Bring them in," he said in a low, gravelly voice. Nate hauled in load after load of roses, filling every vase, bowl, and flat surface in the room as the old man directed him. It was already strange, but then the man started mumbling under his breath. Nate caught bits and pieces, something about a promise and she'll know. He brushed it off as eccentricity, hoping to finish quickly. When he was nearly done, the man stopped him and said, "One more thing. I need you to place a rose on each step of the staircase." Nate hesitated, but the man was insistent. So he began laying roses one by one up the sweeping staircase, each step lined with the petals as he climbed. As he reached the top, he was about to set down the last rose when he froze. There, on the landing, was a portrait of a woman, stunning but sorrowful, looking out as if she were watching him. Something about her expression sent a chill down his spine, but he couldn't quite say why. The old man came up behind him, placing a hand on Nate's shoulder. "Beautiful, isn't she?" he said softly. "She passed, many years ago, but I promised her roses until the end of my days." Nate didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, feeling suddenly out of place in this time-worn mansion filled with roses meant for a woman who, he realized, had been gone for a very, very long time. After placing the last rose, Nate turned to leave, but the man pressed a heavy envelope into his hand as a tip. "For the roses," he whispered, and with a nod, he watched Nate walk back down the flower-strewn staircase. The next morning, curious about the mansion and its mysterious resident, Nate looked it up. He found an article detailing its history and discovered that the man's wife had indeed passed away decades ago. Some locals claimed he was known to hold midnight vigils for her every year, filling the house with roses. Nate still keeps that story close, saying it's a reminder of love that lingers beyond reason. Now and then, when people ask about his strangest delivery, he just says, "One night I delivered roses to a ghost." We met in 5th grade, two awkward kids who bonded over a shared love of weird snacks and an allergy to sports. By middle school, we were inseparable. We'd sit in each other's kitchens doing homework, scheming ways to avoid gym class, trading terrible jokes and secrets we swore never to tell anyone else. Somewhere along the line, he became more than just a friend. He was my constant, my rock, the one person who made the world feel a little less overwhelming. High school only deepened our bond. We'd stay up late talking about everything, from our biggest fears to our wildest dreams, and I'd go to sleep with this deep sense of security, knowing he'd always be there. He was the one I could text at any hour, the one who could make me laugh no matter what. We'd watch each other fall in and out of teenage relationships, always there to pick up the pieces when things went wrong. People would ask if we were dating, and we'd just laugh. He's like a brother, I'd say, never once considering that it could be more. Then we went off to college in different cities, and everything changed. We promised to stay close, and at first, we did late-night calls, weekend visits, constant messages. But life moved fast, and over time we drifted. The calls became fewer, the visits harder to plan. I missed him fiercely, but I told myself it was natural, that we were just growing up. But there was always this ache when I'd hear his name or see an old picture of us together. I'd wonder what he was up to, if he was happy, if he missed me as much as I missed him. I convinced myself it was just nostalgia, that we'd reconnect eventually, and everything would fall back into place. Last year, we finally did. Both of us happened to be home for the holidays, and we decided to grab coffee. I remember feeling nervous, like I was about to see someone I'd once known intimately, but had somehow forgotten. But the moment he walked in, all of that faded. He was the same, maybe a little older, a little wiser, but still him. We talked for hours, catching up on everything we'd missed, laughing like no time had passed. It felt like coming home. That night, he invited me to a party his friends were throwing. I didn't hesitate. We spent the evening side by side, just like old times, and every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. I brushed it off, told myself I was imagining things. But as the night wore on, something shifted. We were standing on the back porch, away from the noise, and he looked at me with this intensity I'd never seen before. "Do you ever wonder," he began, trailing off, like he was afraid to finish the sentence. My heart skipped, a nervous laugh escaping me. "Wonder what?" I asked, trying to play it cool, even though I felt like the world was tilting. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving mine. "Wonder if maybe we were supposed to be more than just friends?" I froze, feeling every emotion I'd ever tried to bury rise to the surface. I wanted to say something, to laugh, to tell him he was crazy. But instead, I just stared, realizing in that moment that I'd been waiting years to hear those words. Without thinking, I leaned in and kissed him, a soft, tentative kiss that held years of unspoken feelings. We spent the rest of the night talking, admitting all the things we'd kept hidden, all the fears and hopes and what-ifs. It was like opening a door I hadn't even known existed, stepping into something that felt both thrilling and terrifying. By the time morning came, we were both a little dazed, both unsure of what this meant, but knowing that there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, we tried to navigate this new version of us. We agreed to take things slow, both of us scared of ruining the friendship that had been our foundation for so long. It was exhilarating, like discovering each other all over again. But there were also moments of doubt. I'd find myself wondering if we were making a mistake, if we'd lose everything if this didn't work out. Then, one night, after a long talk about everything we'd been through, he held my hand and looked me straight in the eyes. "I'm all in," he said quietly. "I'd rather risk everything than spend my life wondering." And that was all I needed to hear. Now, a year later, he's still my best friend, but he's also so much more. We've built something real, something steady and deep and more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. We still have our inside jokes, our silly traditions, the comfort that comes with years of knowing each other inside out. But now there's something new, a closeness, a love that feels like home. Some days, I catch myself marveling at how we ended up here, how we spent years pretending we were just friends. And while part of me wishes we'd seen it sooner, another part of me knows that we needed those years, that every step we took brought us closer to this. He's my best friend, my partner, my home. And every day, I'm grateful that we took the risk, that we were brave enough to see what was waiting for us all along. It was one of those rare weekends when I had the whole place to myself, and my best friend, Chris, invited me over for his family's annual cookout. His mom, Janine, had always been the one organizing these big gatherings, the type who knew everyone's favorite foods and somehow managed to make everyone feel special. She was warm and welcoming, and I'd practically grown up in her kitchen, eating her lasagna and listening to her give life advice as we all crammed into their cozy house. That night, things went a little differently. Chris left early with his girlfriend, promising to be back before midnight, and I stayed behind to help Janine with the dishes. It was the first time I'd ever seen her without the usual chaos of a full house around her. She looked tired, a kind of exhaustion that went beyond a long day of hosting. I asked if she was okay, and she sighed, giving me a weak smile, saying, "It's just been a hard year, you know." We ended up sitting at the dining room table, talking quietly about everything, from her job to Chris, to her feeling like she'd been putting her life on hold for everyone else. I could tell she'd had a couple of glasses of wine, but even so, the way she looked at me was different. It was almost as if, for the first time, she wasn't looking at me like a kid. And something about that shift, the late hour, her vulnerability, made the air between us feel charged in a way I'd never felt before. It happened fast. One moment, we were talking, and the next, she was leaning closer, brushing my arm as she laughed at something I'd said. Before I could even think, she looked up at me, her face close enough that I could feel her breath. I didn't pull away, and then we were kissing, caught up in something that felt unreal. It was a blur of emotions, the thrill of crossing a line, and the dizzying weight of knowing exactly what I was risking. When it was over, we sat in silence, the weight of what we'd just done settling heavily around us. I muttered something about needing air and stumbled out to the backyard, the cool night air hitting me like a wake-up call. I left soon after that, hoping that maybe we could both pretend it hadn't happened. But the next day, she texted me, asking if I was free to talk. I knew I should ignore it, but I couldn't. I went back, telling myself it was just to clear the air, to make sure we were on the same page. But the minute I walked in, the pull between us was undeniable, and before I knew it, we were wrapped up in it all over again. Over the next few weeks, we found ourselves meeting up in secret, each time telling ourselves it would be the last. It was exhilarating, but the guilt was always there, lingering at the back of my mind. I started avoiding Chris, finding excuses not to hang out, because every time I saw him, I felt like I was lying just by being there. It all fell apart one evening when Chris showed up unexpectedly at my place. I'd left my phone out, and he saw a message from his mom that made it all too clear what had been happening. He confronted me, his voice thick with betrayal, asking if I'd been sneaking around with his mom behind his back. I tried to deny it, but he could see right through me. The fallout was brutal. Chris cut me off completely, and Janine and I agreed to stop whatever we had. The loss of that friendship, of that closeness I'd had with both of them, left a void I couldn't fill. To this day, I think about that night at the cookout and wonder how different things might have been if I just walked away. Now, every time I smell a barbecue or hear the clink of wine glasses, I'm reminded of the night I lost my best friend for good. We'd known each other forever, the kind of friends who were practically family. Our moms met at the playground when we were toddlers, so we grew up side by side, more like siblings than friends. He was the one who held my hand the first day of kindergarten, who taught me how to ride a bike, who teased me mercilessly but always looked out for me. By high school, we were inseparable, the best of friends, with everyone around us assuming we'd end up together one day. But we always brushed it off. "She's like my sister," he'd say, rolling his eyes, and I'd laugh and echo the same. In college, we drifted a bit, each of us exploring our own worlds, dating other people, growing up in separate ways. But we still kept in touch, a steady presence in each other's lives, like a low hum of comfort in the background. We'd call when we needed each other, and during breaks, we'd hang out, falling right back into the rhythm we'd always known. I convinced myself that what we had was pure friendship, simple and solid. He was my rock, my constant, but nothing more. Then last winter, everything changed. We were both home for the holidays, and he invited me to a New Year's Eve party his friends were hosting. I didn't think much of it. It was just another night of catching up, laughing at each other's stories, blending back into each other's lives like we always did. But as the clock struck midnight, something unexpected happened. Amid the laughter and noise, he leaned over, his voice soft, and said, "Maybe this should be our New Year's tradition." I turned to ask what he meant, but before I could say a word, he kissed me. A soft, gentle kiss like he was testing the waters. I was stunned, frozen for a second, but then I kissed him back, my heart racing in a way I'd never felt before. In that moment, everything clicked. It was like we'd been circling this truth for years without even realizing it. After that night, we were both hesitant, afraid to disrupt the friendship that had been our foundation for so long. We tried to brush it off as a New Year's thing, something we didn't need to talk about. But we couldn't ignore it. Every time we were together, there was this pull between us, a sense that something had shifted irreversibly. We started spending more time together, little dates disguised as hangouts, both of us pretending we weren't feeling the way we were. Finally, one night after a late movie, he walked me home, and just as we reached my door, he stopped, looking at me with a mix of nervousness and hope. "Are we really going to pretend that night didn't mean anything?" he asked. My heart skipped, and I shook my head, barely able to speak. "I don't think I can," I whispered. From that moment, we allowed ourselves to explore what we'd found. It was like falling in love with someone I already knew by heart, discovering new sides of him that had been hiding in plain sight. We'd go to our favorite spots, do all the things we'd done 1,000 times before, but now there was this thrill in every look, every touch, every shared moment. It felt like we were rewriting a story that had always been there, just waiting for us to see it. But there were challenges too, moments when we'd both worry that this was too much, that we were risking everything for something that might not last. Every time we argued or had a misunderstanding, I'd feel this wave of panic, terrified that we were undoing years of friendship. But each time, he'd pull me close, tell me that we were worth the risk, and I'd remember why I'd fallen for him in the first place. Now, months later, we're together, and he's still my best friend, but also so much more. We still have our old jokes, our easy laughter, our shared memories. But now, there's something deeper, a love that feels rooted in every part of my life, something that feels like it was meant to be. Sometimes we'll laugh about how long it took us to get here, about all the years we spent dodging the obvious. And maybe we needed those years. Maybe we needed to grow up side by side to finally see what we had. But now that we're here, I can't imagine it any other way. He's my partner, my love, my best friend. And every day, I'm grateful that we took the leap, that we were brave enough to see what had been waiting for us all along. I met Alex at a concert for a local band, where he struck up a conversation with me about the lead singer's questionable outfit choices. He was funny, sarcastic, and had this slightly rebellious edge that kept me intrigued. By the end of the night, we'd swapped numbers, and he'd suggested going out for drinks sometime. He was the kind of guy who seemed just unpredictable enough to make a date interesting but not terrifying, a rare find. A few days later, we met up at a trendy speakeasy he'd recommended. The place had an old-school vibe, all dim lights and velvet booths, and he'd already claimed a cozy spot at the back when I arrived. He greeted me with a big grin and ordered us 2 elaborate cocktails, telling me they were house specialties. From the start, he was charming and a little mysterious, dropping hints about his work in creative consulting, which he never fully explained. Every time I asked what exactly that entailed, he'd just give me a playful smirk and say, "It's complicated." We got through the first round of drinks easily, talking about music, travel, and the oddities of city life. But as we settled into our second round, he leaned back with a look that was both intense and playful. "So," he said, "I feel like we're having a good time, right?" I nodded, smiling, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Then I think you're ready to hear about my lifestyle choice." I blinked, curious but wary. He looked so serious, but there was a glimmer of mischief in his eyes. "Sure?" I said, not sure what to expect. He took a deep breath and said, "I live my life by the rule of 3. He paused, waiting for my reaction. When I just stared blankly, he continued, "It's the idea that everything in life works best in 3s. Like if you're making a big decision or setting goals, you stick to 3. Anything more is just excess." "Oh, that's interesting," I replied, trying to wrap my head around it. But he leaned forward, clearly excited. "No, seriously," he said, "it's life-changing. You'd be amazed how efficient it makes things." He then proceeded to explain that he applied the rule of 3 to everything in his life. 3 daily habits, 3 weekly goals, 3 pairs of shoes, 3 meals he rotated through every week. "I don't need more than 3, he said with conviction, as if this was some sort of universal truth. I nodded politely, trying to see the appeal, but he wasn't done. "I also believe that people should only have 3 main relationships in life," he added, watching my reaction. family, friends, and romance. I don't believe in maintaining connections with acquaintances or people who don't fit into those categories. I laughed awkwardly, thinking he was joking, but his face was dead serious. It's all about focus, he explained. If you limit your energy to only 3 things in each area of life, you're not wasting it on distractions. Pure efficiency. I sipped my drink, hoping he'd change the subject, but he only grew more animated, telling me about how he'd purged his entire apartment down to exactly 3 of each essential item. 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 spoons, he said proudly. And I rotate them for maximum use. No clutter, no waste. He looked so pleased with himself, and for a moment, I thought maybe he'd already hit the peak of eccentricity. But then, he gave me a sly smile. Actually, I haven't told you the best part yet. He paused dramatically. I also only date 3 people at a time. I nearly choked on my drink. Wait, what? I stammered, laughing a bit, hoping he was joking, but he just nodded, as if this was a perfectly normal thing to admit on a first date. Yeah, he said, completely serious. I find that I can be fully present and invested in each relationship without spreading myself too thin. So, you're dating 2 other people right now? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged casually. Yeah, you're my 3rd. That's why it felt right to ask you out. I had a spot open, and you seemed interesting. He grinned, clearly thinking this was some kind of compliment. I stared at him, unsure whether to be amused or horrified. And do the other 2 know about this rule of 3? I asked. He waved a hand dismissively. Oh, they don't really need to know. It's all about energy management. They benefit from it without having to understand the logistics. At this point, I was wondering how to politely make my exit, but he seemed completely unfazed by my silence. In fact, he leaned in closer, giving me an earnest look. I really think you'd benefit from adopting the rule of 3, he said, as if he were introducing me to some profound philosophy. It just clears out all the noise, you know? Uh-huh, I replied, nodding as I tried to figure out how to wrap up the night. But he was relentless. Think about it, 3 favorite books, 3 key goals, 3 core values. If you simplify your life like that, you're really just left with the essentials. He took a sip of his drink, looking deeply satisfied, as though he'd just solved the world's greatest mystery. Finally, the check arrived, and I thought I might actually make a graceful exit. But as he signed the bill, he looked up and said, I think there's potential here. I could see you being part of my top 3 relationships for a while. I managed a weak laugh, grabbing my coat as I thanked him for the drinks. He walked me to my car, and just before I got in, he handed me a business card. Let's keep things organized, he said with a wink. I'll text you on Wednesdays. I usually text my first date on Mondays and the second on Fridays. Keeps things balanced. As I drove home, I kept glancing at the card, half expecting it to say something ridiculous like Alex, life consultant in the rule of 3. When I got home, I tossed it in a drawer, not sure what to make of the entire experience. The next morning, he sent a brief text. Nice meeting you. Wednesdays it is. I didn't reply, but he kept up his Wednesday reminders for a while, always something short like, thinking of you, rule of 3 makes it easy. My friends got endless laughs out of the idea of being someone's 3rd slot. And to this day, anytime one of them goes on a weird date, they'll say, well, at least I'm not the Wednesday girl. And as for me, I've learned that sometimes even the quirkiest charms come with fine print, like must be willing to rotate between other dates on a strict schedule. I remember the first time I took a shift as a late-night 24-hour diner server, thinking it would be a quiet way to make some cash and maybe meet a few interesting characters. What I didn't expect was just how strange and unforgettable that first night would be. The diner was a mix of chrome counters, leather booths, and flickering neon signs that cast a warm glow over the tables. It had that worn-in feel, like it had seen 1,000 lives and secrets pass through its doors. I arrived around 10 p.m. when the night shift officially started and was greeted by Carla, the main night server, who looked like she'd seen it all. First night, huh? She said, eyeing me over a coffee. Well, buckle up. The nights get interesting. I laughed, thinking she was just trying to spook the new girl, but the look in her eyes told me she was serious. She walked me through the basics. how to work the register, where to find the extra coffee filters, and which regulars like their coffee topped off without asking. The first few hours were relatively quiet, with only a couple of regulars in and out, mostly truck drivers passing through or college students grabbing late-night pancakes. Then, around midnight, the door opened, and in walked a group of 3 young guys in mismatched suits, one with his tie wrapped around his head like a bandana. They looked like they'd come straight from some failed attempt at a wedding crash. They laughed, joked, and ordered more food than 3 people could possibly eat. Pancakes, waffles, fries, and even a slice of pie each. I served them with a smile, half amused and half waiting for them to crash from whatever high they were riding. As I cleared their plates, one of them, the one with the tie still wrapped around his head, looked up at me with a serious expression and asked, "Hey, you ever feel like life's just a big breakfast buffet and you've only got one plate?" His friends burst out laughing, but he held my gaze, waiting for an answer. I wasn't sure if he was joking or if the late-night diner vibes had just sent him into a philosophical spiral, so I just shrugged and said, "Yes, sometimes." He looked satisfied with that, like I'd given him the secret to life. And with a final cheer, they left, tossing cash on the table and stumbling out into the night. It wasn't long after that the door creaked open again, and in walked an older woman, probably in her 70s, wearing a sparkly red scarf and more rings than I could count. She chose a booth near the window and ordered a black coffee and a slice of chocolate cake. When I brought it over, she smiled and said, "Celebrating my divorce tonight. Got the papers signed today." She didn't look sad, though. In fact, she looked like she was practically glowing. I offered her congratulations, and she laughed, nodding. She told me a little about her ex-husband, how she'd put up with him for way too long, and how she was finally free to do whatever she wanted. As I listened, I realized this wasn't just a meal for her. It was a toast to a new beginning. Around 3 a.m., the diner was empty, and I thought I might get a break. But just then, a man walked in, disheveled, with dark circles under his eyes and a face that looked like he hadn't slept in days. He sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and stared into it like it held the answers to all his problems. I poured him a refill, and he sighed, finally looking up at me. "My kid's in the hospital," he said quietly, almost like he was talking to himself. "I don't know if he's going to make it." The weight of his words hung in the air, and I didn't know what to say. Sometimes there are no words that can help, so I just poured him another coffee, refilled it every time he finished, and stood there, giving him company in the silence. As dawn began creeping in, the diner lights felt harsher, less warm. I was counting down the minutes until my shift ended, feeling the weight of all the people I'd met that night. But just as I was starting to relax, a woman stumbled in, wearing pajamas and slippers, her hair a mess and her eyes wide. She looked around and finally said, "Do you have nachos?" She seemed almost desperate, like she'd been searching for something all night. I told her we didn't have nachos, but offered her fries, and she nodded, looking relieved, like that would do just fine. As she waited, she told me about her insomnia, how she hadn't slept in days, and that she just had this sudden, inexplicable craving for nachos at 4 in the morning. When her fries came, she dug in like they were the best meal she'd ever had. When my shift finally ended, I felt like I'd lived a dozen lives in one night. Carla waved me over as I was clocking out, giving me a knowing grin. "So, you gonna stick around?" she asked. I nodded, too tired to find the words, but knowing I'd be back. There was something about that quiet, strange space in the middle of the night, about the lives that intersected under the diner's neon lights. As I walked out, the first rays of sunlight breaking over the city, I knew I'd see it all again, and somehow, that was exactly what I wanted. It was a winter evening, just before Christmas, and I'd gone over to help my best friend, Eli, decorate his family's tree. We'd grown up together, spending nearly every holiday side by side, so it felt like just another tradition. Eli's mom, Sarah, was setting up Christmas music, joking around with us, making hot chocolate. She was the kind of mom everyone trusted, warm, funny, and always up for letting us turn the living room into a mess of lights and ornaments. As the night went on, Eli left to pick up his girlfriend, saying he'd be back soon. Sarah and I were left hanging ornaments and laughing about all the ridiculous old ones she'd saved over the years. Eventually, we took a break, sitting on the couch with our mugs of hot chocolate, watching the Christmas lights twinkle. She sighed, saying something about how it was strange spending the holidays without a partner, especially now that Eli was old enough to spend more time with his girlfriend than with her. She gave me this wistful smile, a kind of loneliness in her eyes I hadn't noticed before. I told her she was one of the strongest people I knew, and she laughed, shaking her head. "I don't feel that way most days," she admitted. There was a quiet moment, and she reached out to squeeze my hand in thanks, her fingers lingering just a little longer than I'd expected. She looked at me, the warmth of her hand sparking something that I couldn't ignore. Before I even knew what I was doing, I leaned in, and she didn't pull away. We kissed, and it was like the world outside disappeared. The cold, the snow, even the guilt I should have felt but didn't let myself acknowledge. It was exhilarating and surreal, crossing a line I hadn't even realized was there until I'd stepped over it. When we broke apart, she looked as stunned as I felt, but neither of us said anything. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind, telling myself it was just a weird, fleeting moment. But she texted me later, asking if we could talk, and I found myself drawn back, unable to resist. We met up under the pretense of finishing the decorations, and that one moment spiraled into something I couldn't control. We started finding excuses to see each other, each meeting a mix of thrill and guilt, knowing we were crossing a boundary we couldn't uncross. It all came to a head on New Year's Eve. Eli had planned a party, and everyone was there, ringing in the new year with cheers and laughter. At midnight, I caught Sarah's eye across the room, and for a second, it felt like it was just the two of us, separated by a room full of people. I knew then that something had to give. The next day, Eli found out. He'd noticed something off between his mom and me, the glances, the excuses. He cornered me, asking if there was something I needed to tell him. I tried to play it off, but he kept pushing, and eventually I confessed. The look on his face was like nothing I'd ever seen. Pure betrayal, mixed with anger and hurt. We stopped speaking after that, and Sarah and I ended things immediately. I couldn't look either of them in the eye, knowing I'd broken the trust that had once felt unbreakable. Now, every Christmas season, whenever I see lights or hear holiday music, I'm reminded of that night and the friendship I threw away for a secret that was never meant to be kept. I never thought I'd become a soup lady, but if you stroll through my neighborhood's farmer's market on a Saturday morning, you'll probably hear someone shout, "Hey, it's the soup lady," as I set up my booth, unpacking jars of soup as if they're precious cargo. This all started because I was quite frankly terrible in the kitchen. Cooking wasn't just something I disliked, it was something I actively avoided. I was the queen of takeout, reigning over a fridge stocked with leftovers and a pantry that, on a good day, contained instant ramen and a half-empty box of cereal. But about 2 years ago, all that changed. It was January and I was fighting off a winter cold. The kind that keeps you bundled up on the couch, scrolling aimlessly, hoping something will magically make you feel better. One night, in the midst of my Netflix binge, I saw a character on screen cradling a bowl of homemade chicken noodle soup, the kind with thick noodles and chunks of veggies, steam curling up from the broth. Something about that soup looked so comforting, so inviting, that I found myself craving it intensely. I'd never even attempted soup from scratch, but right then, I wanted nothing more than to make my own. So, I dragged myself out from under the blankets, threw on a coat, and shuffled to the grocery store. I had no clue what I was doing, so I grabbed the basics, some carrots, celery, chicken, and whatever noodles were on sale. I stumbled through the recipe I'd found online, making rookie mistakes, like accidentally boiling the noodles way too long. But after an hour or so, I had my own pot of soup. It wasn't perfect, but as I sat down and took that first spoonful, I felt this incredible warmth. Not just the physical warmth of the broth, but a sense of comfort and pride that I'd actually made something that felt nourishing. From that day on, I was hooked. Soup became my quiet obsession. Over the next few weeks, I tried every recipe I could find. Minestrone, French onion, creamy potato leek. I learned how to simmer a broth just right, to let the flavors come together. My kitchen, once a neglected part of my apartment, was now bustling with pots and pans and bags of vegetables. I'd come home after work, put on some music, and chop and stir until I had another batch of homemade goodness. One weekend, I decided to make a big pot of my latest creation. roasted red pepper, and tomato bisque. My apartment smelled amazing, and the soup turned out so good that I couldn't keep it to myself. I jarred up a few portions and brought them over to my friend's place as a surprise. They loved it, which only fueled my excitement. Soon, I was showing up with jars of soup whenever I visited friends, handing them out like they were gifts. One snowy night, my friend Ollie came over for dinner. I'd made a batch of mushroom wild rice soup, and she was halfway through her bowl when she looked up and said, "This is incredible. Have you ever thought about selling your soups?" The idea seemed ridiculous at first. Selling soup? Who does that? But Ollie insisted. No, really, people would love this. I mean, it's perfect comfort food, especially in winter. You should try setting up a booth at the farmer's market. The farmer's market? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. But after a couple of sleepless nights turning the idea over in my mind, I decided to give it a shot. What was the worst that could happen? The following weekend, I sent in an application, and after a bit of back and forth with the market organizers, who were both skeptical and amused by the idea of a soup booth, they agreed to let me set up a small stand for a trial run. I spent the next 2 weeks in a frenzy, testing recipes, figuring out storage, and learning about food safety. I even designed little labels for the jars, complete with quirky names like Winter Warm-Up and The Green Machine. By the time market day arrived, I had 20 jars of soup, each packed and labeled, ready to go. I was nervous that morning, setting up my booth among the stalls of fresh vegetables, flowers, and baked goods. As people began filtering in, I smiled at passersby, offering tiny samples and chatting with anyone who showed the slightest interest. To my surprise, people were into it, really into it. The market goers, bundled up in their winter coats, loved the idea of grabbing a hearty soup to take home. By noon, I'd sold every last jar. That first day was a revelation. Not only did I make back what I'd spent on ingredients, but I had people asking if I'd be back the next week and whether I'd have different flavors. On the drive home, I couldn't stop smiling. I'd found something that made people happy, that filled them with comfort, and, unexpectedly, it filled me with joy too. Week after week, I kept coming back, experimenting with flavors like butternut squash and apple in the fall and hearty lentil vegetable during the winter months. I added fun combinations, like spicy Thai coconut and Moroccan chickpea stew, which quickly became customer favorites. I even started a Soup of the Month club, where regulars could sign up to get a new flavor every month, packaged in a glass jar with a handwritten note about what inspired it. Over time, people started calling me the Soup Lady, and I embraced the nickname wholeheartedly. I built a small but loyal following, with people lining up on chilly mornings for their favorite flavors. Eventually, I rented a small kitchen space so I could produce more soup and meet the growing demand. I hired a couple of helpers, fellow food lovers who shared my passion for simple, delicious comfort food. Then one day, a local cafe owner stopped by my booth. He'd heard about my soups and was interested in featuring them as a rotating special on his menu. Soon, a few other cafes joined in, offering Soup Lady specials that featured my recipes alongside fresh bread or a salad. My soups were popping up on menus around town, and people started reaching out to ask if I catered small events. Weddings, baby showers, office lunches. I never thought soup would be in such demand, but people loved the idea of warming bowls of comfort food to share with their loved ones. With the business growing, I launched a website for online orders, offering home delivery in eco-friendly jars that customers could return for refills. I even started a blog where I shared my recipes and wrote about the power of food to bring people together. Each post was a little story about the soup's inspiration, like the night I made campfire chili after a winter hike, or the first time I tried to make miso soup from scratch. Now, every Saturday morning, as I set up my booth, I'm greeted with familiar faces and new customers alike, all eager to try the latest flavor. There's this beautiful routine in it, a rhythm I never had in my old job. I used to dread waking up, counting down the hours until I could go home. Now, I count down the days until I can bring my soups back to the market, knowing they'll end up warming someone's home, making someone's day just a little bit better. People often ask if I plan to open a restaurant, but honestly, I love what I do just as it is. I love that my soups go home with people, that there's something shared around a family table or tucked into a cozy corner on a cold day. It's simple, but it's meaningful, and it's more fulfilling than I ever could have imagined. From a takeout queen to the soup lady, my journey has been as surprising as it is heartwarming. And every time someone tells me how much they enjoyed my soup, I think back to that first bowl of chicken noodle I made when I barely knew how to hold a ladle. It turns out, comfort comes in all forms, and sometimes it's in a bowl of soup you make with your own hands, one ladleful of love at a time. It was late on a Tuesday, and I found myself at the 24-hour diner downtown, nursing a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. I was in one of those reflective moods, where all you want is the comforting glow of neon lights and the taste of something sweet. There were only a few other people there, but as I stared out the window, I heard a voice next to me. Let me guess, you're trying to solve all of life's mysteries over cherry pie? I looked up, startled, to see a guy with dark-rimmed glasses and a slightly rumpled jacket. He had a kind smile, and he was holding a plate with a towering stack of pancakes, clearly a man with priorities. I laughed, nodding. You got it. Cherry pie's the answer to everything. Didn't you know? He grinned, sliding into the booth across from me without asking, like he was daring me to tell him to leave. I'm Mark, and I have to say, I'm more of a pancake philosopher myself. They bring a whole different perspective. Well, you're definitely committed to the philosophy, I said, eyeing the syrup bottle he was drowning his stack in. He looked down, feigning deep contemplation. There's a lot to be said for indulgence. Anyway, mind if I join you in solving these life mysteries? I shrugged, feeling too curious to say no. Be my guest, pancake philosopher. I'm Rachel. For the next hour, we debated the great questions in life. Is it ever okay to eat breakfast for dinner? What's the right way to tackle a to-do list? And is it better to dip each bite in syrup or pour it all over at once? Mark had an easy charm, the kind of person who could make you laugh over the silliest things. By the time I'd finished my pie and he'd polished off his mountain of pancakes, it felt like we'd solved a few real mysteries along the way. So, Rachel, he said, leaning back with a satisfied sigh, you come here often for late-night pie sessions, or is tonight a one-off? I shrugged, a little embarrassed. Honestly, I do this more often than I'd like to admit. Something about pie and coffee just clears my head. Then I'm glad I picked tonight to commit to my pancake ritual, he said, giving me a warm smile. I don't usually have company for my syrup debates. We fell into a comfortable silence, watching as the waitress refilled our coffee mugs and wiped down the counter. The world felt far away in that quiet diner, like we were in our own little bubble of neon lights and endless coffee. Eventually, he glanced at his watch, looking reluctantly back at me. Well, I should probably head out before I order another stack. My self-control is not to be trusted in diners. I laughed. Fair enough. I should probably get home, too, before I order an entire pie. He hesitated, then looked at me with a hopeful smile. Would you maybe want to do this again sometime? You know, if life's mysteries need further investigation. My heart skipped a beat, and I smiled back, nodding. I think that could be arranged. Only if you're willing to bring more pancake wisdom, though. He held out his phone, and I typed in my number, feeling an unexpected warmth at the thought of seeing him again. As we parted ways outside, he waved, his smile lighting up the dark sidewalk. See you around, pie philosopher, he called as he walked off into the night. I walked back to my car, smiling to myself, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the best answers sometimes come in the middle of the night over pie and pancakes with a stranger. It was supposed to be a quick run to the grocery store, just a simple task to check off my weekend to-do list. But I didn't know, as I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, that this quick errand would turn into an encounter that would leave me changed. The supermarket was crowded, buzzing with the usual chaos of a Saturday afternoon. I grabbed a basket and started weaving through the aisles, trying to remember the few things I actually needed. But as I wandered through the store, I found myself in front of a small shelf labeled Last Chance, Discounted Books. It was filled with a random assortment of worn, unloved novels and old cookbooks with dog-eared pages. One book in particular caught my eye. It was small, with a faded blue cover and no title. Curiosity got the best of me, and I picked it up, thumbing through its pages. It wasn't a novel or a cookbook, but something closer to a journal, filled with short entries, almost like diary entries or a collection of thoughts. It looked as though someone had left it there by mistake. Then, on the very first page, in neat, handwritten script, were the words, "For the one who needs a reminder." A strange thrill ran through me as I read those words. What kind of reminder? And why did it feel like this book had been waiting for me? I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but everyone was busy with their shopping. After a moment's hesitation, I tucked the little book into my basket and continued down the aisles, feeling a bit like I was carrying a secret. When I got home, I unloaded my groceries, then grabbed the book and settled onto my couch, too intrigued to wait any longer. I opened to the first entry, which was dated, though it looked like the year had been scratched out intentionally. The entry read, "Remember to slow down. Sometimes, the things you're rushing toward aren't half as important as the things you're missing right here." I sat back, feeling a pang in my chest. I'd been running on autopilot for months, maybe even years. It was like I was so busy focusing on the next thing I needed to accomplish, the next box to check off, that I'd forgotten to even look around and appreciate where I was. Each entry in the book was a little reminder like this, a gentle nudge to remember the things that actually mattered. Some were longer, others only a sentence or two, but each one felt like a whisper in my mind, encouraging me to step outside of my routines. One page in particular hit me harder than the rest. It said, "Remember the things you once loved, but put aside. They're waiting for you." I thought about that for a long time. I'd loved painting when I was younger. Hours spent lost in colors, in blending and shading, in creating. I'd even dreamed of being an artist, but that dream had slowly been replaced with the steady march of adult responsibilities. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd picked up a brush. Somehow, over the years, I'd let that part of myself slip away. Reading that entry made something click. That very evening, I went online and ordered a set of paints and canvases. I didn't know if I'd remember how to paint, or if I'd even enjoy it as much as I once had, but I felt like I owed it to myself to try. As the days went on, I continued to read the little book, turning to a new page each morning, letting its words sink into my mind. Each entry felt like it was gently steering me back to myself, to the parts of me that had been overlooked or forgotten. One morning, about 2 weeks in, I flipped to a page with a single line written in the middle. "Be brave enough to make changes, even small ones." It felt like a challenge. I'd been feeling restless in my job for years, but I'd never seriously considered making a change. I'd convinced myself that stability was more important than fulfillment, that I should be content with a steady paycheck and reasonable hours. But this reminder felt like permission to question that, to admit that maybe I wanted something more. That very afternoon, I started looking into courses for skills I'd always wanted to learn but never made time for. I signed up for a few, thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could shift my career in a direction that actually excited me. It was a small step, but it was enough to make me feel like I was moving forward. As the weeks passed, I worked through the book, page by page, each entry opening me up to a new thought, a new perspective. I felt lighter, like I was slowly shedding layers of doubt and hesitation. I started taking more time for myself. Long walks in the mornings, little weekend trips to places I'd always wanted to see. I even started calling old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, rekindling connections I'd let slip away. One day, about a month after I found the book, I came to the very last page. I felt a pang of sadness, realizing that my time with this strange, beautiful little book was coming to an end. I'd grown attached to its quiet wisdom, to the way it had gently nudged me back to life. On the last page, there was one final message. Now that you remember, go out and live it. It felt like a send-off, a blessing. I closed the book and sat there for a long time, thinking about everything it had taught me. It hadn't given me any grand revelations or drastic changes, but it had done something better. It had helped me see the small things, the overlooked moments, the forgotten joys. It had reminded me that sometimes the best parts of life are the quiet, simple ones we let slip by unnoticed. After that day, I kept the book on my shelf, a reminder of the journey it had taken me on. Whenever I felt myself slipping back into old routines, I'd pick it up and read a random entry, letting its words bring me back to the present. A few months later, I was in that same grocery store, walking past the little last chance shelf. And there, Sitting on top was another book, different from mine, but with the same look, the same worn cover and faded pages. I picked it up, flipping through it, and found a note inside the front cover. For the one who needs a reminder. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a sense of déjà vu, like I'd been handed a strange and wonderful gift for the second time. I realized then that maybe that little book was never meant to stay with me forever. Maybe it was meant to be shared, passed on to someone else who needed its words. So I bought it. I took it home, read through its pages one last time, and then left it on a bench in the park with a little note inside. For the one who needs a reminder. I hope it brings you as much as it brought me. And as I walked away, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that somewhere, someone would find it. Maybe they'd pick it up on a whim, curious, just as I had been. Maybe they'd carry it home, flip through its pages, and find their own reminders waiting there. And maybe, like me, they'd discover a part of themselves they've forgotten along the way. Our school had this super rigid bell system that rang between every class. It was this loud, obnoxious tone that you could practically hear from a mile away, and it ruled our lives like a prison buzzer. So, naturally, the idea hit us. What if we had our own bell? Something that no one could predict. Something random that would drive everyone, especially the teachers, a little crazy. Enter Tony, the tech genius of our class, who somehow managed to get his hands on a wireless speaker small enough to fit in the ceiling vents. He spent a full weekend rigging it up, placing the speaker in the main hallway near the gym, which was prime territory for maximum chaos. From there, he synced it to his phone, so he could control it from anywhere. The plan was simple but perfect. Tony would randomly play the school's bell tone between classes, making it sound like the bell had gone off early. Then we'd all just watch the pandemonium unfold. The first time it happened was during second period on a Monday morning. Out of nowhere, the bell tone blared over the hall speaker, and you could see the teachers and students hesitate, wondering if it was a glitch or if class was really over. A few teachers poked their heads out of their classrooms, confused, while students just looked around, thrilled and ready to bolt. But when no one made a move, everyone just sat back down, shrugging it off as a fluke. But Tony had only just begun. Over the next week, he hit random times every single day, sometimes a few minutes before the real bell, sometimes right in the middle of class. Each time, it created this low-key wave of chaos. Teachers started checking clocks nervously, some letting us out a few minutes early, and students were living for it. People were making bets on when the mystery bell would strike again, and it became this huge guessing game. The best part? No one suspected it was us because everyone figured it was just a technical glitch. Then, in a stroke of genius, Tony scheduled a bell to go off just 10 minutes after lunch started. The bell rang, and within seconds, the entire cafeteria erupted as students scrambled to leave, thinking lunch had been cut short. Some teachers tried to stop the stampede, but most were just as confused as we were pretending to be. The principal got on the intercom, trying to restore order, but by then the damage was done. Half the cafeteria was empty, kids wandering back to class with trays of food like it was the world's weirdest fire drill. After that, the administration was on high alert. They even brought in the district IT guy to check the bell system for malfunctions, but, of course, they found nothing. Meanwhile, Tony kept the game going, setting the fake bell to go off at totally random intervals, always unpredictable enough to keep everyone on edge. Finally, on the last day of school, Tony decided to go big. He played the bell sound every 5 minutes during the last period, which basically turned the entire class into a rotating door of students and teachers trying to figure out if the day was ending early. It was absolute chaos. The principal was pacing the halls, red in the face, while teachers threw up their hands, not even bothering to keep us in our seats. At the end of the day, Tony played the bell one last time, and as we walked out, the whole senior class let out a cheer, like we were celebrating our freedom from the world's weirdest science experiment. As we left, Tony sent one final message through the speaker. Class of 2023, signing off. To this day, the mystery bell remains an unsolved legend at our school. They replaced the entire bell system over the summer, but every now and then, we hear rumors that students still talk about it, wondering who or what was behind the phantom bell that haunted their youth. I met Nate at a friend's backyard barbecue, where he stood out instantly, not just because he was tall and good-looking, but because he was wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat, sunglasses, and an aggressively floral Hawaiian shirt. He looked like he was on vacation in his own backyard, which, given that it was autumn and cooling down fast, was pretty bold. When he struck up a conversation with me about grilling techniques and the meditative power of charcoal, I was intrigued. He had this easygoing vibe, and I thought, why not? So when he asked if I'd like to go on a culinary adventure with him, I agreed. We met at a sushi place he'd recommended, a tiny spot hidden behind an unmarked door that felt like some kind of secret food club. I arrived first, and a few minutes later, he walked in wearing a vintage leather jacket and a scarf with fringes, looking like an explorer from a bygone era. He gave me a big grin and settled into the booth, barely taking off his scarf before he began explaining the concept of omakase. The chef chooses the dishes. It's like a journey through flavors, he said with a faraway look in his eyes, as if he were about to wax poetic about sashimi. We ordered, and as the first course arrived, he took a deep breath, closing his eyes to savor the scent. The Japanese call this yoin, the lingering feeling of something, he murmured. I nodded, trying to keep a straight face, while he gave a reverent bow toward the sushi chef as if he were some kind of sushi shaman. The evening started off amusingly enough, with him detailing his food philosophy. Apparently, he didn't just enjoy food, he experienced it on a spiritual level. He went on about how each meal should be an emotional event, like we were discussing a piece of art. I thought it was charming, if a bit dramatic, and was half expecting him to write a poem about the tuna. Then, halfway through our third course, he leaned in with an intense look. I don't think I mentioned this, but I follow a pretty unique diet, he said, lowering his voice like he was about to share classified information. I smiled, expecting some variation on vegetarian or keto. But no, Nate was far more original. I only eat foods that align with my energy frequency, he said seriously. I call it vibrational eating. I blinked, trying to hide my surprise. Vibrational eating? I repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it make sense. He nodded enthusiastically, clearly thrilled that I was interested. Yes, everything has energy, frequency. If you eat food that doesn't match your energy, it disrupts your harmony. He gestured to the sushi. For example, this tuna has a very grounding energy. Great for stability, terrible for creative flow. So I only eat it when I'm in need of balance. I stared at him, both fascinated and completely baffled. He went on to explain that he had a frequency chart for foods which he'd created himself after months of research and self-experimentation. Apparently, leafy greens had high vibrations, perfect for days when he needed inspiration, while root vegetables were low frequency and only suitable for moments of deep introspection. So, do you avoid certain foods based on your mood? I asked, trying to follow his logic. He shook his head, looking mildly offended. It's not mood, it's energy alignment. He went on to explain that he'd gone through phases of detoxing from certain foods after bad energy encounters. For example, he'd given up garlic for an entire year after what he described as a traumatic date involving a garlic-heavy pasta. I laughed, assuming he was joking, but he looked at me with an entirely serious expression. I'm actually working on a book about it, he said. It's called The Frequency of Flavor. I think it could really help people live more harmoniously with their food. I nodded, biting my lip to keep from smiling too widely. But he wasn't done. He then pulled out his phone to show me a color-coded chart he'd made, categorizing foods by frequency. He had columns labeled high vibration, medium, and low, with foods like kale, almonds, and blueberries in bright green, and things like cheese and potatoes in a dull gray. See, it's about achieving balance, he explained. High-frequency foods lift you up, low-frequency ones ground you. You eat based on your personal needs. At that point, the waiter brought out a course with eel, and Nate's face fell. He turned to the chef, looking grave. Do you have anything more high vibrational? He asked, waving his hand over the eel as if dispelling dark energy. The chef just nodded, unfazed, but I was trying desperately not to laugh as Nate leaned over to me and whispered, Eel is practically a frequency black hole. It just sucks your energy in. We managed to make it through dinner, though he declined a few other courses due to vibrational concerns, including anything with rice, which he said was too grounding. But just when I thought I'd heard it all, he invited me to his place to see his crystals. I almost said no, but the night was already so surreal that I had to see where it was going. His apartment looked like a mystic's den. There were candles everywhere, crystals in every size and color on almost every surface, and incense burning so heavily I could barely see. He led me to his energy corner, where he had a crystal altar with stones he claimed were attuned to different emotional frequencies. "This is rose quartz for love," he explained, holding it reverently. "And this is black tourmaline for protection." He placed it in my hand, looking deeply into my eyes. "Hold it. Feel its power." Trying to keep a straight face, I held the stone, nodding as he watched me with an intense, hopeful expression. "Do you feel it?" he whispered. "The energy, the strength?" I managed a polite, yeah, it's grounding." And he looked genuinely thrilled, as if I'd just validated his entire worldview. And then, as if the night couldn't get any stranger, he picked up a large amethyst and cradled it in his hands. "This one," he said, his voice soft and reverent, "is for cleansing. I use it to recharge my food." He went on to explain that he developed a ritual where he placed his meals in front of the amethyst for 10 minutes before eating to clear away any negative vibrations. "That must take a lot of patience," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. He nodded, his eyes alight with purpose. "It's a small price to pay for purity." He then offered to cleanse my aura, using a smaller crystal wand, waving it in intricate patterns around me while whispering a sort of chant. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped back, looking satisfied. "Your energy is much brighter now," he said approvingly. "You were carrying some low-frequency buildup. But don't worry, it's gone now." I smiled weakly, mumbling something about needing to get up early in the morning. He walked me to the door, holding out his hands in a gesture of gratitude. "Thank you for sharing your energy with me tonight," he said, his voice filled with solemnity. "I really felt our frequencies align. Maybe next time, we could do a full moon ritual." I'll think about it," I replied, trying to hide a smirk as I made my escape. The next day, he texted me, feeling the connection from last night. "Let me know if you're interested in exploring higher vibrations together." I didn't respond, but I couldn't stop laughing as I replayed the night in my head. And now, anytime I see a crystal shop or hear someone mention energy, I think of Nate, his frequency chart, and the night I was almost convinced to cleanse my sushi.